Recording in progress.
All right, welcome everybody. Let us begin directly, as always, with a consecration right away, in which we give up the fruits and merits of our actions, the karma of our actions, the authorship, the doership, just taking a moment to step back, to relinquish identification with the one who is doing, and that means by relinquishing the identification, meaning we're not doing it because it's what I want or what I think I need or what I want to be recognized for, things like that. We do our best to move the I, the limited I, in the background and simply offer ourselves as a vessel, as an instrument for the Supreme Divine to work through. Of course, we cooperate. Of course, we are always present in our awareness, whether we are actively participating or receptively participating. I remind you, it is usually grouped together as speech, thought, and action. So it's not only action, but also what you do with your mind, what you're doing with your word. All these things, for the moment, for this session, we suspend our identification with, and then we ask for support, for grace, for illumination, for correct understanding, kind of like that everything plays out favorable for ourselves and everyone involved. If you want more details, you can go to the first installment of this series where we explored it a little bit more in depth. For now, we will directly go into the consecration, where in your own words, you close your eyes, take a deep breath, and settle down in your heart, your center, scanning all the way down to your base, rising all the way up to the top of the crown, top of your head, top of your skull, and from there, with firm intention, relinquish any identification with the authorship, with the doership, giving up all claims to merit as well as the karma associated with learning, with doing, with thinking. And instead, we ask for support. We ask for the supreme grace to be bestowed upon us. And out of this optimal condition, we then continue onward. So for now, a few moments in your own words. Interiorize and express this thought. Relinquishing control, identification, asking for support. Begin now. And then, in your own time, take a deep breath in And then from your crown, descend back into the rest of your body, expand through your senses, and then in your own time, take another deep breath in, opening the eyes. And then I'll welcome you back here once again to our little encounter. Welcome.
Namaste.
Namaste.
To our little encounter. Very nicely described. The descriptions are always very good. I hadn't got a chance to. I did briefly, but not briefly enough. Well, not enough to have a look what you sent through in Telegram last night. If you want to, I can remember Napoleon Hill, and actually somebody that I really don't know too much about, or yeah, if you want to dive into kind of, I don't know if that's something you wanted to do.
Yes, sure. So,
It's up to you. You can go wherever you want. You know how it is. Any subject you want to do, you do. No, no limits.
well,
Well, I don't know. Maybe YouTube has limits, but
exactly. That's exactly what I thought. But yes, so the idea was, and we talked about a little bit about this yesterday. There's many different directions that we can go. Um, I do believe that a lot can be derived by really studying and exploring the foundation of whatever um, philosophical or even technical system that we explore. There's a lot of specialty knowledge where we often have some kind of superficial understanding because we heard about something of like, oh, we have the two-slit experiment and there's entanglement and particles interact. When they're in flight, they behave like waves. And it's kind of these type of pop sci culture. They give us some idea, but the problem with it is often it's more calling it clickbaity is maybe going a little bit too far, but very often it's a little bit more sensational. It's like, oh my God, this is so incredible. Nobody understands how physics works. And that's just like hyperbolic, right? That's just like an exaggeration that is easily used to intrigue people. It's like, oh my God, it's so fascinating. The universe is so much more than we thought it was, and nobody understands, nobody knows anything. And that's, of course, um, yeah, a little bit misleading. But it's also very difficult because very often the the details are quite subtle, and often it does take a bit of an investment in terms of time and study to really understand the implications and why certain things, like what are the fundamental pieces are, and then what are consequences that simply derive from it. So another approach would be to explore principles, to explore ideas in the context of specific scenarios, and then by focusing on specific concerns, then we can explore, okay, what would it look like if we go like this? What would it look like if we do something like this? For example, many of the older traditions, they came out with just a few elements, right? Usually sometimes it's 4 elements, right? When you think the elements of the zodiac, you have earth, water, fire, air, and then in between, when two are joined, in between there's the fifth element, so technically you have 5 elements. In a similar way, you have 4 elements in the Chinese metaphysics. There you have what you have, like earth, metal, fire, water,
Wood.
wood. Wood is ether, right? Wood is like the same as space or time. Metal is the one that corresponds to air. Then there's fire, water, earth. And earth sometimes is used as the first one, but sometimes it's also used as the element that delineates the other 4. So see, sometimes the roles are reversed. What we would use in the Indian system, like things that we have from the Hindu pantheon, for example, they're usually the quintessence, like the one that's in the background, is called akasha or space, or something that represents space or time, and that's the one in the zodiac that is in between connecting the elements. But in Chinese, again, very often when you have like the four domains, then the earth element is the one that delineates. So you always have to understand and explore these things within a particular tradition. Sometimes a word has a particular meaning in one context, and the same word shows up in another setting, in another tradition, and it means something different. And that's often more tricky to get right than if you have two completely different words, where it's clear, okay, this is one word and this is another word, and then there's no confusion. Whereas if you have the same word and once it means this and once it means that, it's a little bit more, tricky to get right. However, there are some common principles. And there are, let's just go through them in a way. I like to draw on this book written by the Dalai Lama. I mentioned it before, The Universe is in a Single Atom. Of course, it goes into all sorts of ideas and concepts where the Dalai Lama talks about how things are understood in the Buddhist setting. In the audiobook, it's read by Richard Gere. And then that was done in collaboration with David Bohm, the physicist. And so Bohm was very open and was very well disposed from Eastern mysticism. In fact, many of the people that are known for their scientific accomplishments, they have studied all sorts of literature, and very often their inspiration did actually not arise from what they studied in the West. Of course, they studied the Western thinkers, and they studied the different technological ideas and the mechanical models and all that, but very often they ended up drawing from Sanskrit scriptures, from Hindu scriptures, from Buddhist scriptures. Not so much the Chinese, the Taoist scriptures, but in Asia, many of these things have influenced each other, so you end up seeing the same idea that there was some sort of common history. And so the East has been a source of very fertile, let's say, stimulation ideas. And this is often a bit trivialized. There's like, these primitive cultures, they thought there were only 5 elements, but now today we know that there's however many 100 and something elements in the chemical table of the elements of chemistry. But of course, just because we call it an element, once we have the 5 element and once we have over 100 element, it doesn't mean that they are the same. The elements, the basic elements, are to be understood. Again, there's many nuances, but if you want to just make sense of it, usually we start with the earth element, because the earth element is the basis, it's simple, it's stable. So, think of what does a rock do, or what does a patch of earth do. It's just there. It doesn't do anything, it doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't have any dynamics, it doesn't really change anything. Or at the floor in your living room, what does the floor do? It's just, its function is to be stable, it's to be reliable, right? It's not suddenly tomorrow it's somewhere else. It's like, no, you have a consistency that you know from one moment to the next. And it's, in many ways, it's very basic, but at the same time we can also consider that it's very fundamental, because if you don't have stability, imagine an ocean. The ocean is of course, is the water element, where we have liquidity. However, that liquid body rests on an ocean floor. If you remove the ocean floor, first, if you just have a lake and you pull out the floor, of course, then everything would be floating or falling down. But imagine you have a whole body of water. Let's say if Earth wouldn't be like a planet with some water on the surface, but what if the whole body would be water? Then any disturbance, any displacements that you would have, a wave, for example, would just keep going and going and going and going. These days, with ocean shore and resistance from the ground, waves, they encounter friction. If they come too close to the shore, they rise up, and eventually they cascade, right? They break. And in a more subtle way, the same thing also happens with the tides, right? The tides push up against one coast, and then they recede again. But if you remove the continents, then that whole system would be much less stable. So even for something like the ocean in the background, you still have the earth element, which affords stability. Now in physics, what is considered a strongly coupled theory means like something that is interacting with itself strongly. You can think that, well, that things are more tightly connected in a sense that they affect each other. This is more relevant if we go to more extreme conditions where, for example, something gets very cold. In some cases when it gets very hot as well, when you have like not just liquid, but then when the liquid becomes more like plasma, like so you have a liquid where you still have the different elements, like I'm talking about the chemical elements, they are more freely moving around. But then when it goes into plasma, then the electrons get unconfined, deconfined from the proton, and then the electrons can flow around freely, and then something that behaves like that, then is a liquid, becomes more like a metal. Like a metal is conducting electricity because the electrons are not associated with one specific core and tied to it, but they are in a grid where it's very easy for one to move in on one end and then pushing all the electrons through, and they move out on the other end. So solid state, like fixed form, and liquid are considered strongly coupled theories. One of the interesting aspects with that is that they tend to be more or less fixed in volume, right? If you heat it up, it expands a little bit. If you cool it down, it shrinks a little bit. Like if you have a metal or something, right? You have this, it changes a little bit of the size. But when you have a gas, for example, because a gas is not strongly coupled, that will always fill out whatever space you give it. You go into a vacuum and you open one bottle of whatever gas, that bottle will fill the whole room. And if you end opening a second bottle, then that second bottle will also go into the whole room, and then the pressure will double, right? There will be a change if you add more gas, but it's not like just because, sorry, what's happening here? Just because we have a fixed space. Let's say if you would do the same thing with water, right? Everything would fall to the ground and the water would fill up however much water you have, and if you add more water, then you have the water level increases. So that means the gas in this case, is more volatile, it's less stable, and it's also less connected. Like a liquid still kind of behaves like one body, right? Yes, if you have a large liquid, you start to have flows. You end up having currents, and that already introduces some amount of dynamism. But when you think, what can you have in the ocean? Yes, you can have currents that go one way or another, or underwater in the depth of the ocean. Sometimes you have currents that go under another current, or that they rise up. But when you compare this to the air element, where you have wind, where you have gusts of wind, and then they whip around and then they create turbulences, and then the pressure drops on one side, and then it comes into focus and generates more pressure, it generates heat, and then we have thunderstorms with all the frictions with electrostatic and all that, right? The air element is one that is much more dynamic. But now we skipped over one, because first we have the earth stability, then the water liquidity, and then the principle of fire is really a principle of fusion ultimately. It's associated, it's closely linked to order, order in terms of organization, in terms of structure. That, let's say, if you take a piece of wood which has carbon, and you set it on fire, and it draws oxygen from the air, and the oxygen comes to the carbon and makes carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is more stable than the carbon before, or than the oxygen before, and it is so because together, when they come together, they interact. They go to a lower energy state, like, kind of like if you have a ball uphill and you let it roll downhill, you can say it's on a lower energy state when it's on the bottom, and then it's more stable, right? If you have a well, it will sink on the bottom, and once it's on the bottom, it will not randomly go back up. The same is true for carbon dioxide. If you have oxygen and carbon, you burn it, you liberate energy, and that energy is freed because the whole thing goes to a lower energy state, which then makes it more stable. In another way to look at this is also that it becomes more more structured, more ordered. It prefers to be in a lower energy state where it has more stability, more of this centeredness. And so ultimately this approach to fusion is about information. Like let's say if you have 100 people, you take 100 people and you organize them by, I don't know, like weight or height or wealth or whatever, age, any attribute, anything that you can linearly, any two you can order them next to each other. Now if you line them all up, let's say take them by size, right? The shortest to the longest. Then you have some amount of order that is now you have more information about how they relate to each other as before, where everyone was just all over the place, or also even just to get everyone in one line is a more ordered condition. And so in the same way, fusion, the way so just to be clear, carbon oxygen, burning wood, is not fusion, but it gives us some idea of the principles that then apply for fusion. Genuine fusion would be, for example, taking two chemical elements like hydrogen and combining them together to make helium, right? Then you change from one chemical element into another. If you have carbon and oxygen making carbon dioxide, you still have carbon and oxygen, like the patterns, the elements are still the same, they just couple together. So in a way it's a more crude level of bringing things together. But the principle is very similar, that when you take two hydrogen atoms, you bring them together into coherence. Coherence, that means you need to get them to the point where you can no longer distinguish them. So if you would take, I don't know, an egg or an orange, you can say, okay, I have one, I have another, they roughly look the same. If I have one, how do I make them not distinguishable from each other? Well, I just smush them together and put them in the same place, and then you can say we can just squeeze them together, and then they are just one egg or one orange or something. And, or tennis ball, whatever you want. Like you take two and you smush them together until they merge, and then they become one. But forcing that already intuitively, you can see that's not really a really sound process. Now, with some material that might work. Sometimes you can compress things together, that two bodies, I don't know, if you have maybe clay or something, maybe you can squeeze it into each other, that it kind of merges, but it's a physical merging, it's not a fusion. Whereas for it to become fused, what needs to happen is that the wave function, like the way that we're not just taking individual atoms, how they behave, how they synchronize. And so with music, with tones, we have a frequency, right? That we have over time passing in a linear forward fashion, and then we have a frequency on that time. But that applies for things like light, for things that move at a uniform speed. There's also the concept of phonons, which is similar for material properties, but it gets much more complicated once you have individual physical particles, because a particle it has additional degrees of freedom. Because if you have, let's take the speed of light, you can never catch up with something at the speed of light, because if you would move at the speed of light and something would be moving at the speed of light, you wouldn't be able to see it. It would disappear, right? Because you wouldn't see any change anymore. Whereas with a physical object, so an object that has mass, you can always catch up with it. Oops, I realize I need to. Apologies, I quickly need to do something. I forgot the power.
Recording stopped.
So these sort of things you can look at presentation
Recording
by
in progress.
you can look at presentations by Nima Arkani Hamed, but he has like this. He has many of these presentations when he, for example, talks about the Higgs, how the Higgs is coupling. So the Higgs is a fundamental particle, a fundamental force, if you will, and it couples things that don't have any rest mass. That means they cannot stand still, they cannot sit still, they always move at the speed of light. So these are the bosons, like the photon, light being a boson. And then the particles that have mass, they also have a location. That means they are limited in how fast they can move. And that's where we have these things, that everything moves slower than the speed of light. That means anything with mass and anything without mass moves at the speed of light. Now, because you can catch up, like let's say I throw a tennis ball, but then I catch up, I take a motorbike or a car or something, or a rocket, and I fly next to the tennis ball, then I can look at the tennis ball and I have an isometry of space, meaning like in all 3 dimensions, it more or less space looks in all directions the same. So if it throws with, I don't know what they throw them at, like 60, 70, 80 miles per hour, and then I catch up, then it looks like the tennis ball is standing still in air, because if I'm moving at the same pace. And because of that, we have 3 components. For every component in space, there's a separate wave function. And that means if you don't just have to match the frequency, right? The frequency is like a linear thing. You just dial one order until you catch the same frequency, and then basically you synchronize 2 particles. But over 3 dimensions, you have now 3 components that you need to synchronize. And that means it gets very, very rare, very improbable that you encounter a situation where two atoms suddenly, out of basically coincidence, end up sharing the same frequency in all 3 dimensions. So not just on 1 dimension, not just in the direction of time, but imagine that time had like 2 more components that are perpendicular to it. That's kind of the idea. And if that happens, you have something called quantum tunneling, and this is actually what happens in the sun, right? The sun is neither big enough nor hot enough for there to be this hot fusion that they're trying to do with all these now more famous reactors, like all these big machines. They're basically trying to have a controlled explosion, and with strong magnetic fields that they're trying to get everything confined together to make it very, very hot, and then they tell you how many million degrees it is and how much hotter it is than it is on the sun. It's like, yes, because the sun is doing something different. It doesn't mean that it can't work, but it raises the question to what extent that we enjoy a proper understanding, because nature tends to be a good baseline for whatever we want to do. I'm not saying we cannot do better than nature. We can improve on nature, because sometimes nature is defective, sometimes things are imbalanced. That's the whole modality of healing, is about improving health. But it starts with understanding the condition first. But if you want to increase your vitality, you first have to understand to some level what it means to be vital, what it means to be healthy, what it means to be strong. And so in a similar way, I sometimes have some question marks how wise it is just to try to force particles together. Even if we can pull it off, it may be rooted in an incomplete or a problematic understanding. And whenever I have an incomplete understanding of a situation and I start to interact with it, then my model, to the extent that it's inconsistent, will give me projections or solutions that then end up causing difficulties, causing problems, running out of sync. Right? Imagine you're navigating by a map, but the map is kind of like a little bit twisted to the physical world. Then you keep following the straight line on the map, but on the physical plane, you end up deviating more and more and more and more. So in a similar way, we need models that arise and originate from the physical world. The physical world, I mean, what is the physical world? All we have to go by is really our sensory experience, because we can say, okay, we can make an objective measure and we can have an exact definition of how many cycles of a cesium atom, that how many times it has to vibrate until we call it a 1 second, and then how far light goes in. And we can be very specific about these things, but whatever we do in consciousness. We reason in consciousness, we think in consciousness, we communicate, we write, we test, we experiment. Even if I set up a whole laboratory and I make a big experiment and I test all sorts of things, still the experiment, the instrument with which I'm setting up the experiment and make the arrangements and observe the whole experiment ultimately is in consciousness. This is just a point of view, right? Other people might argue, no, really the thing that really is there is the basic building blocks, the basic pieces, these atoms that are basically just like billiard balls. They're just kind of knocking around, and then if you have a lot of them, they kind of interact and rub against each other and build up charges, and somehow on a high level it appears like it's feeling like something, like it has consciousness. And then we have of a sorts the illusion of being conscious. And then people go further in that direction. It's like, I know that means that there is no free will, because according to this philosophy, everything is mechanical, everything is predetermined, everything is basically just a big machine. And then within this big machine, we humans somehow are silly enough to think that we are aware, that we have a choice, that we have free will. And then you can, the world is full of people that somehow, I can't quite understand why one would go there, but somehow their reasoning has developed in a direction where they mainly explored all the limitations. It's kind of like I turn around and go to the wall and say like, see, I don't have free will because I cannot push through the wall. I was like, yeah, but the freedom has nothing to, I can just walk around the wall. I can blow out the wall if I want to. I can, there's many things I can do with a wall. I can ignore a wall and go the other way. There's not, just because we have walls, that's not an argument. That's not a basis that there is no such a thing as free will. But freedom of will is something very subtle, and so it's more something that has to be explored subjectively, in a sense of like, okay, in terms of, let's say, self-determination. To what extent am I able to determine my own future, my own life? And then you can say things, well, there are circumstances, there are biological factors, there are cultural, like societal factors from nature and nurture, your environment you grow up in, the parents, your friends, your school, and all that. And of course, that does have an influence. And one direction is going like, oh, I'm just going to look at my entire biography and then I'm going to explain everything away based on something in the past, and then whatever I am or I cannot do, I'm going to explain by something in the past. But the problem with that, of course, is the past is something that we cannot change. So it's very limiting. Now, if I want to coordinate and I want to know where I'm coming from, or how fast I've been moving, or how far I've been moving, it's good to look at the past and say like, let's look at the things that are not going to change and let me relate to that. But when it comes to looking forward in terms of what is possible, the past does not determine the future. We, moment by moment, our degrees of freedom increase. Even on the physical level, the universe literally is not big enough or complex enough to contain its entire future, to even contain its next moment. Because anytime we interact, anytime we test, like on a quantum mechanical level, it is not just that we learn about the information, because remember these 3 dimensions that I told you about? The same way, when we measure something, we always have to make a choice. You always have to measure one thing at the expense of something else. For example, if you want to know how fast something is moving, to be more accurate, you need to have a little bit a longer observation in time, and then okay, one snapshot, here it started, and then it moved that far, and then in the next second or in the next moment, it's here. And then I know exactly, okay, in between, I have a high degree of confidence, a high degree of certainty in terms of standard derivation. I can be very sure. Yes, close to this speed it's been moving. But if I make that interval very, very small, and I say like, okay, here, did it in between these two moments, how fast has it been moving? Yeah, well, you don't have enough measurement, like duration. The sampling that you have is very limited, and therefore it's uncertain. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's a little bit less reliable. It's like you see this sometimes with pictures, taking pictures from like long exposures to short exposures. So if you want to know exactly where something is, then you need to have a snapshot, a short exposure, like boom. Like you just, for a moment you have a flash, and then everything is very sharp. You know exactly which piece is where. Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? You know exactly. But you have no idea, from a momentary snapshot, you have no idea how fast it's moving. Whereas if you do a long exposure, and you want to say, okay, between these 15 seconds, the car, let's say you imagine at night you have a car on a road or something, say, okay, in these 15 seconds it's been driving around this curve and going up, and now I have like this one smear of the lights that draws out the whole track that it has been taking. But now it's smeared out. Now I can no longer say as clearly where exactly the car is, because it's not well defined. Within 15 seconds it's not in one place, but it actually has displaced itself. It has moved over many times the length of the car, right? So the same way, even if we want to measure the spin, so the spin is an internal property. It's a feature. It's a trait of an atom, like anything with a charge. So the electron in the atom has a spin, and that spin. When we think of spin, what does it look like if something is spinning? If I'm spinning around my own axis, if I have a top and it's spinning, if a wheel is spinning, right? We always think of one axis, and then it's spinning around that axis. Yes, but in quantum mechanics, we don't have access to the whole space. We have to define the axis first, and then once we pick an axis, we make a selection, then along that axis, we can then observe, we can then measure, we can then from the choice of the axis get a binary result. Either it's spinning in like clockwise or counterclockwise, right? It's like a binary choice. Either it's forward or backwards. But if I pick a different axis, the first axis has nothing to do with the second axis, right? It doesn't. Just because I know how it's spinning in this way, I can make no inference whether it's up, down, it's spinning this way or in reverse. And then when I measure the second one, I have to drop everything I knew about the first one. So the weird thing about this is that it amounts to what we call measurement selection. So the way you choose to measure is fact creation. Like the fact that you choose one way or another way to measure, just that choice already is creating a piece of information that hasn't existed before, and then you get a result. And the somewhat bizarre thing is, if you really see, like if you have a cube or just like a three-dimensional space like we do usually in our human life, we have forward, back, left, right, up, down, right? Separate dimensions. However, the weird thing is, quantum mechanically, they are correlated with each other. This started out with Bell's inequality, that Bell came up with a test, theoretically, and said like, well, in principle, what you're saying, this coupling between how speed, like momentum, and position, how these two are related and how you can only measure one at the expense of another, that means there is a correlation between them. And then he came up with the famous Bell inequalities that then a few years later were demonstrated, like affirmed, confirmed, demonstrated that this is so. And it gave probabilistic predictions whereby the the best case that you could get with what was called hidden variables. Like if the electron secretly would know which way it's spinning, it's just not telling you. There's a limit if you separate two of them and you do the experiment. There's a limit how much information you can encode in there in 3 dimensions. But if you do these experiments, there's somehow another piece of information. It's not local, but it's global. Means like it's, if you want to think of a variable, you can say, okay, there is a common variable that they somehow both are aware of, but it's not local. It's not in one electron, it's not in the other, and it cannot be communicated by the speed of light. There must be something like in the background, like the whole universe somehow has additional information. And then this was then further developed from Bell through Koch and Specker, that then it became a more rigorous theorem, also in terms of mathematics and geometry. And then they realized there was Anton Zeilinger, G.H.C. Greenberger, Horne, and Zeilinger. These 3 guys, they came together and they said, well, if you don't take 2 electrons and entangle them together, but you take 3, then you can set it up in a way that you can, with 100% certainty, that means with the probability of unity. The probability is 100%, means like you know what's going to happen. You can exactly predict what the outcome is. And they were able to predict things that wouldn't be possible to, you couldn't get there with hidden variables. Hidden variables means like that there was a piece of information locally stored. So they ruled that out. And that experiment then was later confirmed and amounted to the Nobel Prize for these 3 gentlemen in 2022. So this is something that is very, very well confirmed, and this is something that is not possible within classical mechanics. Like this entire model of billiard balls and flat space and time that moves like a translucent block of ice, or like Newton said, that even if nothing happens, time still progresses. All these things are on very shaky ground, and I would say they're basically all ruled out, because if we don't have any change, there's nothing from which we could even infer that a clock has passed. A clock always passes time or indicates the passage of time because it identifies a certain change. And with this approach, from this measurement selection being fact creation, the interesting part is that it's actually path dependent, right? If you, let's take it from 3 dimensions for a moment, we take it down on 2 dimensions. Let's take a chessboard, like a checkers board where we have black and white squares. You could say, I can either move 1 up and 1 to the side, or I can move 1 to the side and 1 up, and I arrive in the exact same place. That is valid if the order of events doesn't matter, if you don't have any path dependence. So if it doesn't matter which path, if it only matters where you start and where you end up with, then you have multiple paths that pretty much, they amount to the same. However, if you first wash a shirt and then iron it, or if you first iron a shirt and then wash it, you will get a different result, right? Because it matters which one comes first and which one comes later. And the same thing happens with these measurement selections. You measure one, and then you measure another. Even though you do the same 2 measurements, you end up in a sort of, basically, you want to think of it like you end up in a different universe, right? Like you make a choice. Either you go one way or you go in another way. And then then in the second choice, you make the one that you, let's say, I go left. Let's take the checkers board again. I go left and then up, or I go up and then left. You would say, well, I would arrive in the same place. It's like, yes, you arrive in the same place, but in an alternative universe. Now, this does not require you to believe that the multiverse is real and that all these universes are real. I'm not demanding that, but I would encourage everyone to become comfortable with that idea, just to explore what the implications are. Because you don't necessarily need to agree that all these possible universes are real or that they are equally real. But just think about when you make a decision. I don't know, like where you want to go to holidays. You want to go to the mountains, you want to go to the ocean, you want to go into the jungle, you want to, I don't know, some people like to surf, some people like to hike, some people like to climb, right? You have different options. And so before you take an action, in a way, you explore the different possible or even probable futures. And then maybe the situation gets more complex, because maybe you want to go together with friends. And then maybe you know that certain things are going on. Maybe there's, I don't know, there's a surf competition, or maybe there's a particularly good season weather-wise to go up to the mountains, and there's maybe in this time of the year it would be the best time to go mountaineering, whereas surfing maybe you have more flexibility. Or, like there's different factors that come in, and then the people that might be involved, then you start to run scenarios. What if we do this? Well, some people say, well, if this happens, then I won't come because I only want to do this. Okay, then you end up with a combinatorial explosion. You say, what if we do this? If this person comes here, if this person makes this choice here, and you kind of explore all the possible configurations, all the possible futures, and in a way, they mutually affect each other, because you always compare and contrast. What would you like more? What would be better? What will make, I don't know, what will make everyone happier or more joyful or more free, or whatever you want to go towards. In a way, these potential realities, even if you haven't taken any step, you haven't made any choice, you haven't acted on anything, simply the exploration, simply that they are possible, in a way they interact, at least within your subtle reality, they begin to interact with each other. And so in a similar way, you can extend the model to the physical, that in principle, the physical world is able to interact with itself. Now, if you're in separate universes, like if you have like a choice to go one way or to go another way, let's say there's two tunnels in front of me, and I can go in one tunnel going to one direction, or in another tunnel going into another direction. Now, if I choose one tunnel, obviously in that tunnel, I cannot crash into myself in another tunnel, because they're separated, right? However, I personally believe that gravitation is not limited to that. I personally believe, again, you can have your own opinions on this, but I am quite convinced that gravity is something that, at least to the degree that our realities are similar, that it kind of leaks. That, again, gravity is not a physical thing like a rock that you can crash into, so you don't have like this kind of immediate interaction. But I do believe that the mass associated with a particular reality is able to be perceived, and that means indirectly it's also that you can observe it. Right? If the mass is big enough and the displacement is large enough, it should be possible to essentially have like a quantum mechanical experiment that shows you that the object, you moved it in one direction, but because in a other reality the quantum mechanical solution was to move the same big object in another direction, then maybe if they are similar enough, there are effects that can be observed. So I'm just pointing this out, that like, yes, on one level we separate, like logistically by any choice we branch things apart, but at the same time it all does unfold in a common milieu, in a common realm. And that is because in the background of this, consciousness is always universal. So me having a conscious experience, you having a conscious experience, you having a conscious experience in the future, tomorrow, or in the past, yesterday, it's always the same principle, the same awareness. The awareness within you is the same awareness within me if we go deep enough. right? On a surface level, I can say, well, I have my own personality, and I know who I am, and I know where I got up this morning, and I'm my own person. I have, hey, sure, sure. But on a deeper level, just think of it in terms of perception, in terms of an experience that you're able to perceive a sensation like touch or a pinching, right? In a way, kind of like pleasure or pain. The basic modality behind that is to observe change, to perceive something changing, potentially transforming, and usually that change is gradual. It doesn't have to be gradual, right? Sometimes you have like a binary choice. It's either this, either it happens or it doesn't happen. Either you start a fire or you don't start a fire. You don't kind of maybe start a fire a little bit, try to, I don't know, take a gallon of, I don't know, kerosene or oil or something that burns, and you light it just like in one area. It's like, no, if you light it in one area, the whole thing goes up in flames, right? So sometimes you do have this kind of large scale, it's either one way or another, but very often the transition are more gradual. And while both solid and liquid elements are considered strongly coupled, if something's only solid, you tend to have a kind of like grains that they are more crude, right? When you think of how does sand flow? Yes, if you have a lot of sand, you make a big hill, it kind of slides down. There is a kind of like, you can say sand is flowing, but everyone understands it's not the same thing as a wave, right? A wave is very elastic, and if you displace it one way and it very naturally relaxes and it moves through and it spreads out. Whereas with sand, we haven't seen that, and much less with mountains. Doesn't mean that mountains don't move. Just means it maybe takes millions of years, right? Until a mountain gets deformed, gets eroded, or rises up. It just moves much slower and in a much more crude way. And the main thing is with solid matters, you often see that you can get a crack. You can get a crack in a porcelain vase, in a floor, in a wall, right? If something changes, it's usually not elastic, and there's no gradual transformation. Whereas in a wave, you can't have a crack in a wave, because even if you try to cut the water, take a knife and you rip it through the water, it separates it for a moment, and it comes together, and then pacifies and smoothens out. Right? So because of this, I believe, for practical purposes, like if you wanted to look at what to explore, yes, we can start with the most basic element. We can start with the earth element, stability. However, if we only deal with the earth element, only like dry things, like sand of sorts, or even big blocks of whatever, big blocks of rock or something, it is limited in the sense that you don't really have any gradual transformation. As a snapshot, it's okay. If you want to know, I don't know, in a hockey game where the puck is, or in a football game where the ball is, it's going to be in one location because there's only one, right? Where exactly it is, again, if you zoom in enough, it gets more smeared out, because unless it's static while it's moving, there's some amount of uncertainty associated with that. But when you think in terms of hydraulics, then the entire system is completely connected. Let's say if you have like a car lift, where you have like a pump and an oil and then a cylinder, and you turn on the pump and then it raises up the whole car or truck or whatever you're lifting, or lowers it down. And it's very direct, because the volume is confined. You increase the amount of oil, pushing in more oil, the cylinder expands, and therefore there's an immediate action as a consequence. But it is gradual. You can add a little bit, you can let out a little bit, you can add a lot, you can remove a lot. And so the reason why this is important is that much of what we are interested in as humans is not only how things are or how things should be, right? If you want to build a shelf, yes, you want it to be fixed, you want to put it there, you want to stay there, and whatever you put on it, you would prefer it to stay. You don't really want it to float around through the room and change its shape. It's like, no, a shelf has to be fixed, right? But that's more for storage. That's for archive. That's for artifacts, like things that we want to persist, like a record, and it just stays over time. Yes, it's useful to have things fixed, but when you think in terms of just driving a car, driving a bike, or even walking, yes, sometimes you walk when you, let's say, when you go straight, you go faster, and when you have to turn, you slow down. But it's not that you have a high speed and a low speed. Go fast speed straight, and then you stop, and then you turn. It's like that. Robots kind of sometimes they behave like that if they have a very crude way of modeling. But when it comes to regulation, you have the dynamic component. Dynamic means something that changes over time. Let's say if I throw a ball, I bring my impulse forward, I throw, I accelerate, and in the very, very last on top, I give it the maximal impulse. So it's like I accelerate the ball higher and higher and higher until I deliver the maximum speed. But it's a gradual acceleration. It's not that I'm picking the ball and then I'm kind of like just kind of shoving it. That's like I could push a ball and then it would, fall somewhere. But for regulation, for coordination, anytime you do sports, but I'm just saying sports because that's something where we have a dynamic experience on an intuitive level. But the same thing applies for things like computation, for finance, for prediction, to fly a plane, for example. Any dynamic interaction, it's absolutely crucial that we have a model. Technically, this is called fluid dynamics, like the dynamics that arise of fluids. But you have to understand, when we talk about fluid dynamics, we just mean the way it behaves, like the way a liquid behaves. In many ways, has a lot of similarities how a gas behaves. Even though, like I said, the gas can be compressed and uncompressed. But if you have something like an atmosphere, just like a more or less homogeneous density, then you start to have currents and flows that are a little bit more volatile, a little bit more dynamic, but they share many principles with the liquid. That's why liquids and gases are governed. They're both in the category of fluid dynamics. So we had solidity, stable, fixed. Liquidity, gradual transformation. Then fire, the principle of fusion, of taking multiple parts, components together, and then implicit in them there is a higher order. And I think it's important to remember that there always is some type of order or even experience that is implied. For example, Michael Levin talks about this when he says, like, if you would fuse the minds of sorts of two people together, so if you and I would fuse our minds together, I'm not gonna learn what it's like to be you, and you're not gonna learn what it's like to be me, because if I fuse myself with you, I'm still me, I'm just now also you. So that means we both learn what it means to become us, like us as a composite, but we ourselves remain part of it. And so in the same way, many things could be described and developed and shaped that multiple parts come together and they give rise to a larger system. Let's say our solar system, right? We have a bunch of planets which are somewhere between liquid and solid rocks, right? Some of them are more fluid, some of them are actually more gaseous, others are more solid, but it's basically just a body in space. It has a certain mass, maybe it rotates, and then it moves. It has a mass, and it moves, but it's in space. It moves. How do you know it moves? It moves with relation to some other object. Usually we take we have in a simplified way, we think, the sun is at the center of the solar system, and then all the planets go around the sun. And the sun, we call it a fixed star to make the idea very clear. This is fixed, doesn't move, and then everything else moves. But again, this is a bit misleading because it's not technically accurate, because the center of our solar system in terms of gravitation is actually just outside the sun. And that's because if you have the sun here, and Jupiter is going to be out of the picture. But if Jupiter is very, very far away, but still Jupiter is quite heavy, much, much, much smaller than the Sun, but still a significant portion. That means the average, the center of mass from the center of the Sun, because of Jupiter being so far out and being so heavy, is actually pulled out just below the surface of the Sun. So all the bodies in our solar system, they don't really orbit around the Sun, but they orbit that point. So the Sun is slowly orbiting around the point kind of on the far side of Jupiter. And then of course the other planets also have some effect on that. And so you see, even though you can see every planet could say like, well, I'm the most important one, I'm the center and the foundation, right? We used to have this with the Earth, with the geocentric universe. So we said like, okay, we have the Earth, that's the center of the universe because that's where we are, and since we are conscious and we are humans, and obviously the whole universe was created for us humans, for us to have this experience, which today is not something that people of science necessarily would defend or uphold, but psychologically it's very different. It's very interesting, and also ontologically, you can say, hey, I don't know what it's like to be anything but human, because even if I look at an ant, I experience the ant through a world that I experience as being human, or any other experience, right? You look at the star, yes, but you can only look at the stars as a human. We don't know exactly what, let's say, okay, mantis shrimp is underwater, but the mantis shrimp has, I think they have 8 or even 12 different receptors. Like we humans have 3 of these cones that are sensitive to a particular frequency of light. We think, oh, we say so many millions of colors. But again, that's kind of metaphorically true, but it's not technically true, because technically what we see is we see three channels, red, green, blue. And they are, blue has a particular frequency and red has a particular frequency. Red is a low frequency light and blue is a high frequency light, right? And so we have physiological thing that chemically interacts. If it's stimulated by a particular frequency, we get a chemical signal one way, and if it's in a different frequency, we get a signal another way. And if you have then a combination, like a mixture of different intensities, like a lot of blue and a little bit of red, then you have like the regular colors of the, let's say the watercolors, right? You take a lot of red and you add a little bit of blue, and then you get a little bit of purple, but it's not a very dark purple, it's more on the red side of the purple, right? But that's coming from basic components, combined, mixed together, giving rise to the entire spectrum of colors, right? And our world seems very colorful. And yet it begs the question, why these 3 colors? It would be quite interesting, because sometimes, and I think it's only existing in women somehow, that, but like 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 or something, they have 4. They don't have 3, they have 4. And if you think in terms of how you can combine them together, this is like, you don't have like from 3 to 4, you don't have 25% more, but it's more like going from 100 and you add a 0 and you go from 100 to 1,000, right? It's like an entire order of magnitude, like it's massively more. Even though you say, well, but from 100 having 3 digits and now I go to 1,000, I'm just adding 1 more digit and I'm just making the number 25% longer. It's like, yes, but it's not increasing by 25%, but it's actually increasing by a factor of 10. So the same thing will be true for people who have these colors. And then there's also experiments, there's something called impossible colors, like where you have complementary colors. One is, I think it's called like a reddish brown or like an orange brown, and one is like a greenish, what is it? A bluish yellow, I think, that then ends up looking like green, kind of like the matrix green. You can do it with just holding something close to your eyes. It's a little bit easier if you have an AR or VR headset, because then you can have the exact same picture in a different color. From you see in one color, you see it, like these old color glasses where you have like a red and blue. Yeah, but there you just kind of generate the 3D effect. If you have a full-on picture with complementary colors, then your brain somehow creates internally an additional color, a color that you cannot physically. They're called impossible colors because physically that they're not possible. This is a parallel. I'm not going to say it's the same, but it shares a lot of similarities with binaural beats. Binaural beats means you have one frequency on one ear. You need to have headphones. You can't really have with speakers. It's more difficult because then both ears kind of pick up both speakers. But if you have isolated from headphones, you have one frequency on one ear. You can take the headphone off. You listen here, one frequency. Here, another frequency. You put both on. Somehow, there's a different frequency. There's a third frequency that arises from the interaction of these two frequencies, and it's used often for meditation, astral projection, and people use it for all sorts of things, like to be very focused, to study, to be creative, to be productive. Because the moment you have a synchronization between the left and the right half of the hemisphere, it's always like when you have plus and minus. In between, you have the zero, but the zero is something that transcends. Right? You have polarity or duality on a lower level. If you balance them, then you end up on a higher level. Like this is a quote that is attributed to Einstein, that no problem can ever be solved on the level of consciousness that created it. But you only, whenever you have a conflict like a dilemma, you always need to rise up to one higher level of consciousness. And I mean this in a more technical sense. We can always say like, I know you just need to be more wise than however stupid you were when you caused the problem. Now you need to be more wise, so you have more insights. Like, okay, this is kind of generally true, but that's not a very useful and certainly not in any way technical. However, if we go back to Potter's box, we talked about this a little bit earlier on, that you have these 4 fundamental assumptions, like these questions that one way or another, if you want to
Lost you, Fab. Lost you. You cut out now.
Recording stopped.
I've paused the recording.
It's always a bit of fuckery with the battery. Can you hear me again?
Yeah,
No?
got you back.
Yes? Okay, good.
Okay, I can't you in. 3, 2, 1.
Recording in progress.
Okay, so we had examples like the Potter box, and again, this is just a tool. This is just a way to kind of for yourself to illuminate how is your thinking, how is your way of processing, how do you relate to the world? Because for ordinary purposes, you can just, monkey see, monkey do. You just do whatever everyone else does, and you can just kind of copy behavior without really understanding. If you push the button on the bus or on a subway, why does the door? You don't need to understand. You just know, push the button, the door opens, you get in, you get out, finished. But if you want to explore novel ideas, if you want to participate in shaping the future, quite possibly your own future, right? It doesn't have to be some grandiose, world-changing affair, but simply for your own sake, it's good to understand why you believe the things that you believe, and to also understand limitations in a sense of that doesn't mean that things are wrong, but just means sometimes you have a particular view that you understand very well, and then there are other views that you might not you might not understand this well. For example, this is okay, this comes from the land of politics, but I feel it's maybe good to also consider. It's a little bit colorful, but of course, in its implications, it can be very severe. And this was I don't remember what the journalist was. I can find out. There was a journalist that was saying something in Washington, and Karl Rove, so the Republican. He pulled the Democrat to the side, just like in a hallway chatting, and this journalist was there, kind of witnessing the whole thing, and he says it's the problem with you people, what's wrong with you people, and then the guy goes like, well, what do you mean? Where's this coming? What do you mean us people? It's like, you guys, you Democrats, what's wrong with you guys? You always have the same problem, and it's like, okay, maybe just wants to insult, maybe. And so so that the Democrat didn't really say much. It's like, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, you guys, so Karl Rove is the one saying that, you guys, you still live in a fact-based reality. And the guy goes like, oh, well, yes, of course, like that's what we base our arguments on. It's always a question about how do you know the facts. And then Karl Rove says like, yeah, but see, you need to understand, we are an empire. We simply act. And then you guys can run around and complain and make drama and complain and cause a whole scandal. Meanwhile, we act again. And then again you can scramble around and see what we did and complain about all the horrible things you disagree. Meanwhile, we act again. Right? And this view, for example, is an authoritarian view. It means it's a point of view that some people entertain as a philosophy. I don't think it's by any means a complete philosophy, but you need to understand these sort of things because there are some people that think like this, that they believe the only thing what matters is power and the control of that power. And all, let's say, law, ultimately, what is legal and what is not legal only matters as much as the law has teeth, right? That means it comes down to who evaluates, like the judge, and who enforces the law. Because if the judgment is unfair or if it's not being enforced, it doesn't really matter what the law says. And so these people that have an authoritarian mindset, they say like, well, as long as we are the stronger, as long as we are on control of of whatever force, that usually means physical force, usually military, police, these sort of things. As long as we control how the force is applied, we get to do whatever we want, which of course then causes a lot of difficulties because on that basis, you no longer have any safeguards. Like, how are you going to be sure that it's going to go in a good direction? It's going to be healthy. People say like, I know I want to be free, and it's like, I'm free. I'll do whatever. It's like, yeah, but you might do something stupid. You might do something harmful, right? And then when we look at the incentives, and this has general to do with the human character and the human soul, right? The human soul, in a sense, you can metaphorically, but it has more implications than you might be aware of in the first moment. You have to consider that the soul is a sort of kind of like a battleground between divine, like positive, and evil, negative forces. And you can witness this within yourself, right? Sometimes there's pain, or you feel attacked, or you feel it's usually some fear-based emotion, something around pain or threat or something, that we can very easily consider something where we would degenerate, where we would go on a lower level of operation, where we become more aggressive, more willing or capable to encounter aggression, maybe act selfishly, like to do something that we know is at the expense of others, for example. Right? Under duress, we kind of, it's like wounded animals. We start to behave in a way that is very much cagey, protective, potentially aggressive. And then there's the other side, where we can take a step back and say like, okay, let's say there's a child, there's a limited amount of food. Okay, I'll be fine if I don't eat right now. I'm not gonna, just because if there's not enough food, I'm gonna give the food to the child, and the child can have the food because we want to care more about something that is more young, more delicate, especially if it's like a teenager, maybe you can say you can also handle it, right? But if it's a newborn, if it's a young child, no, it deserves and is entitled to a high amount of care, I would say, as we enjoyed when we were children, right? So in a way, there's this, sometimes we look forward and sometimes we look back. Sometimes we want to find ways of taking care of the elderly, or sometimes it's about protecting and safeguarding and promoting the gestation of the new ones, the young ones. And so we constantly have this battleground in between positive forces and negative forces. And it really is up to us. Ultimately, it is about our character development of what we will engage with, what we will go along with, and what we won't. But for this to be going in some sort of a healthy direction, we need. I like the idea just because it's very non-political, and people can come from whatever tradition, and I don't really think anyone really has any issue with that one. In the Hindu pantheon, it's called the Sanatana Dharma. Sanatana Dharma is a sort of like an eternal religion, like a force, an evolving force, where just naturally living system tend to strive, to evolve, to expand, to develop towards something more refined. And they, again, it's just a word. It's just like it's not a Hindu technology or a Hindu system. It's just an idea that in the background there is this sort of eternal religion where everything is subject, or you could think of the curriculum, the meaning of life, at least to some extent, is this evolution, that we are here, born on a planet with life support systems, with some degree of agency, where we can make some choices, where we can take some actions, ultimately to refine ourselves. But if we want to achieve a certain nobility, a certain refinement, that is something that has to arise from within. It's not something, you cannot train people to be selfless and just say like, well, okay, if you're not selfless, you're going to be punished. No, then they're going to behave selflessly because they try to avoid pain, because they try to avoid the punishment. But that's not good enough. Like for kindergarten, yeah, sometimes you need to put certain rules. Like, look, if you cross this, if you go overboard, there's going to be a penalty for that. And that's kind of like the ideology of the entire legal system. But the legal system has a function to protect people and to safeguard people, so that things don't go overboard too much. That's its function, to people not be unrestricted, that the people don't end up harming other people, that there's a corrective measure that can stop certain things if it starts to cause too many difficulties, too many problems. And at the same time, that's an incomplete vision, because it will not tell you what to do with your life, how to spend your time, what to aspire for, how to guide your conduct, how to guide your choices, because those are more subtle and ultimately divergent concerns. Divergent concerns means, like with the electron, like with measuring the spin, every time you measure one axis, it will always be at the expense. If you have 3 dimensions, you pick one axis, you always have to give up the perpendicular plane. You lose 2 when you pick one. You can select 1 degree of freedom, and by doing so, you give up the determination of 2 complementary ones. And so in that, anytime you make a choice, anytime you develop something defined, again, the legal system is very good, or the whole political apparatus is very good, including science and engineering, is to constrain the space of all possible futures to mandate, to determine a particular outcome. And if you know what you need to get to, yes, these tools can be very useful to get to the place that you think you need to get to. But the basis of where to get to is often not explored. And the basis for that, one way to look at it, is in this framework of Potter's box, where you have these fundamental assumptions to do with cosmology. Why is there something rather than nothing? Or why is there something and in the background nothing? Like, how did nothing arise out of something? Or how are these two related to each other? Was there always something? Was there always something and nothing, for example? Or was there nothing and then the nothing magically gave rise to everything? Right? It's like whatever your explanation is for that, it's a good idea to consider that and to consider what other people believe. You don't need to believe what other people believe, but it's important to be able to understand. Like, if you have somebody that follows a different ideology, it's a little bit like somebody who upholds or practices a different language, a different tradition. It's not that one language is better or worse. Some languages are very useful for engineering, whereas they're useless for poetry. And other languages are very great for poetry, but they are struggling. They're limited in being precise and exact. And so this is the first one of these questions to dealing with cosmology and what we call cosmogenesis, like how does the cosmos arise, what is it generated by which principles, what is consistent. Then the next one is teleology. Again, it's just a fancy word, but it's like telos, just think of a telescope. Telescope is a structure, you can pull it in and you can extend it. And so a teleology is something that gives you an idea of a pattern that unfolds and generates a particular direction. This can be a direction, like a mechanical direction, like in the case of a telescope, but you can also say in terms of the teleology of a baby, of a young human, is to become a mature and eventually an old human, because that's part of the direction that is implied. It's not as much of a mechanical thing, but it's still there is a teleological view that certain things will unfold, certain things will develop. Now, within one human life, we can simplify many things, and we can shave off all sorts of consequences by simply ignoring everything that lies outside of one human life. And this is why Buddhists have this statement that they talk about breaking free from the confines, breaking outside of the confines of one life. That means you have one birth and one death, and that defines your life, your immediate physical, biological life. That's what you share with all the animals and everyone, that like that you have survival, that you have resources, that you have threats that you to manage, that you need to food, shelter, some social organization, like all that is just something that applies to one life, including families and whatever you can have and whatever you can create, whatever you can be known for, just one life. There's nothing wrong with one life, but if you want to guide your conduct by something, it should be guiding you towards something, giving rise of something beyond. Now, there's many ways how you can go beyond one life. You can, for example, you can say, in Buddhist metaphysics, you have at the center of the wheel of time, the Dharma chakra, Kala chakra. Like there's like this big being that holds like a disc, and it has like the six realms. One is the divine realm, the demigods, and the human realms, the hungry ghosts, and the hellish beings, and the animal. Like these are the six realms, and then there's like the 12 links of dependent origination. And there's the Buddha on the outside that points out to the moon and says like, well, all of this whole that whole circle, that is just that's just like the wheel on the universe on autopilot, basically churning. But the solution, the actual liberation, is out there. You have to hit another point that is outside this whole system. So that's why you always have the Buddha pointing to the moon. And at the center of this, there's the three, what they call the three root evils. But it doesn't mean, it's not evil in the sense of like a bad entity that is out to harm you, but it's more like a defect, like a force that if you don't understand it correctly, if the force is in charge, it will be harmful. If you're in charge, you can manage the force, and maybe you can even work with the force. I'm going to get to what that means in a moment. So the forces, these three forces, again, they're usually called the three klishas, the three root impurities, sometimes they're called the root evils. They are anger, desire, and ignorance. Anger is the force that repels, like the pressure, right, that you reject, that it aggravates. Desire is the force that attracts, that motivates you to pursue something, to get to something. And ignorance is a little bit more subtle, because it's kind of in the background of all of them. Like both of these are just, the misunderstanding is only possible because of the ignorance, and ignorance means because there is something to be known which we either haven't learned yet, don't know yet, or we forgot. Right? Sometimes you know things, and then in a moment of heat you forget about it, and then after you did something that was silly, you're just like, oh yeah, fuck, I should have known, Actually, I knew that's going to happen, but in the moment I didn't care, or something like that, right? That's kind of like an ignorance. I'm ignoring what I know to be true, to do whatever I want, and then I have consequences, and I come back and say, oh shit, I should have, maybe I shouldn't have done that. So ultimately, the cure of avidya, the cure of this ignorance, is to know, but it's not an external knowledge. It's not a knowledge of a materiality of some content, but it's a knowledge of that background, like something before content, before forms, before differentiation. And ultimately, if you develop an awareness in there until it stabilizes, until it becomes dominant and it becomes permanent, then that background, that you establish yourself in that supreme state, in that divine reality, that supreme reality, that you become, that it becomes fixed. There's even in Kashmiri Shaivism, there's even the expression that you need to be buried in consciousness. That means, you know, like if you bury something, you dig a hole, you take a rock or a clay tablet or whatever you want to bury, you put it down, you place it, you put dirt on it, and you load it back up, and you fill it, and you cement it, you fix it, you boom, and it's there, and it's never going to go anywhere because it's fixed. So that type of fixation you want to achieve not in the world of matter, but in the domain of the supreme reality of the, whatever you call the divine consciousness, that you are so firmly established there that no matter what happens, come hell or high water, like whatever tensions or turbulences, like that is there, and through that, because you know that, implicitly there is faith, right? Faith is something that we use in many different ways, also in a lot of stupid ways, right? We can be convinced of all sorts of stupidities, and then we act based on them, and then sometimes I think they become self-fulfilling prophecies. Now, this is not talking about materialistic faith, like in a sense of like, if I step out of the house, I have faith that the ground is going to hold, or if I push a button to open a door, I have confidence. It's not that kind of faith. It's not the kind of faith of like, oh, if I swallow a pill, I'm going to get healthy. That's also a type of faith. But it is the faith that there is the divine consciousness in the background, because it cannot not be. There needs to be, for me to have a conscious experience, for you to have a conscious experience, for both of us to have a conscious experience and being able to relate to each other, there needs to be some common denominator. There needs to be a common principle, a common mediating factor. And how can it be in me and in you and not in between? Like, then how does it get from me to you? Right? There, you can say it's very basic, and maybe it's just electrochemicals. Maybe I can only send you an email or a text or a voice note or something. Okay, even for that to work, there still needs to be a common substrate, a common medium, a common fabric, a common realm that mediates all of this. Otherwise, you would have separate universes that you and I couldn't interact with each other. We wouldn't be able to even be aware of each other. So there is this type of background awareness, and then knowing that that is there, being aware of that 100% of the time, day and night, again, in good experiences and bad experiences, then from there you're able to first become lucid, clear, to discern, but then also, because you're in contact with that reality is available to you, and you can become a channel, you can become a conduit of grace, of inspiration. Suddenly, if you have that awareness, suddenly there's like a thought, like maybe you never thought about it like that, but in a particular moment, there's something that stands out. It reminds you of a random other thing. You could have thought of 50 other things, but somehow your mind, you can call it your subconscious mind or whatever you want to call it, somehow it puts you in touch with exactly the piece of information that is relevant now for this person in this moment, right? And then from there, all sorts of things start happening that they will never violate causality. You will never take a picture and say like, I got caught God right-handed, he was messing with. It's like, no, it will never come like this. I mean, unless you have like some divine intervention, some miracle, but that would be very, very rare. The usual case is that things just happen to be. Things just come together in, I don't know, you missed the bus, you took a wrong turn, you ran into somebody that you haven't seen and that person tells you something that they just ran into like all sorts of things where somehow everything was up in the air, and somehow things just kind of found their way, that the right pieces got connected to the right pieces. And you can say like, well, that's just coincidence. Sure, you can always dismiss these type of things as from the outside, right? If I look at like a scientist, I want to be skeptical. It's like, I'm not convinced of that. I don't know, maybe you made this up. Maybe it was just like a random sample. Maybe you had bias. Maybe okay, sure. But you can't do better. You can't really solve it externally. But subjectively, if you start to explore this, if you do, let's say, meditation practice, or it can be formal meditation practice. I personally also practice Tai Chi, for example, which is a different type of active moving meditation practice. Then there's people that explore different ways of working with energies, and right. There's many ways. I'm not going to say it has to be one way or another, but something that deepens this awareness, that goes into this realm of cosmic consciousness, so that you can be aware of it, and you will know this, and you will know because it will come through your consciousness. You will be aware of it as it happens. You will notice it, and the feeling will be different. Sometimes random things happen. You just throw a dice a few times, and you will have not really a very emotional response, whether it's a 6 or whether it's a 3 or whether it's just a bunch of eyes, a bunch of nods, and just usually. And then when something happens, when let's say two people talk to you about their separate issues, let's say one is about relationship, one is about another person in their company, it has nothing to do with each other, and then suddenly you recognize, wait, but there's like a red thread, there's like a correlation, and there is a deeper common reality of something that is going on that manifests in one person's life in a particular way, and in another person's life it manifests in another way. This is very common, for example, with astrological influences, and we're now in a phase we're building up, think for another 4 weeks or so, until the 28th of February, where we're going to have a particular arrangement of 7 bodies in the sky. Anyway, it's just one of them. Of course, we're always under the influence of the planets are always going to be somewhere at any point. So they're always, if you think of the background of the universe relating to you, it relates through the configuration as you find yourself. And so again, you believe in this, you don't believe in this. I'm not going to go in a debate about this right now. I'm just giving you an example that would be a circumstances where everyone happens to be under a shared influence globally. Of course, subjectively we have different ways that we relate to different elements stronger, or let's say I'm an Aries, and therefore for me Mars is more relevant than for others because I have a closer relationship. Or I don't know. Of course, everything is related to everything, but some things are more emphasized than others. So, with these sort of things, we have a way. Think of it like an energy that affects everyone, that floods everyone, like the sun shines on everyone without discrimination, saints and horrible people. Like nice people and unkind people, murderers and saints, let's say. The sun shines on everyone. The sun shines on the plants. The plants grow food. The plants can't discern whether the food is going to be eaten by a person that is going to be doing good about good things or not good things. Like, no, that's not on the level of the basic of the reality, but that's something that comes later. That's something that only with consciousness we have this discernment, where we have this ability. And then you can say, oh, but I was really drunk and therefore I'm not accountable, because it's like, okay, but really, you can deceive others, but you can't really deceive yourself. When you look at yourself, could you have made a different choice? Could you, like, for example, how did you get to a state where you were so drunk? Maybe there's a question mark behind that as well. Like, how did you even get into this situation? Because maybe there is some sort of a questionable choice. I'm not saying it's implicitly bad, but like, if you get to a state where you end up making a decision that you say, I shouldn't have done that, then the question is, how do you get there, right? We can always find excuses and blame it on circumstances, but that's not very useful, because that's not something that is within our control. The question is, everything being the same, if I end up in the same circumstances again, what is necessary for me to make a better choice, to find a pathway towards a better outcome? And then again, the better outcome comes back to, well, what you believe is actually meaningful, what is actually significant. Because if we're just within one life, If it's just about selfishness, like, okay, I need to secure some resources and some agency, and then maybe, I don't know, have some things to accumulate and maybe some social position. If it's just about that, okay, that's one way to view it. When you think, oh wait, but if I'm acting very aggressively, right? We had these three root evil. With ignorance, ignorance, stupidity, sometimes it's linked to fear, but it's a little bit too general. It's not really active. Like there's a in Tibetan Buddhism, for example, it's called Vajra Arali, but it's very difficult to find information around. There technically is a path, but I'm not aware. I studied materials from Alexander Bersin, who used to be, or maybe still is, a translator. He's a Sanskritologist. He's in maybe, I think it was just his 80th birthday a few years ago. So he's older, but he's still alive, and lives in Berlin. And he said himself that he's not aware of anyone who is practiced. It doesn't mean that it's dead. Maybe there are some people practicing it, but to work with ignorance directly is much more tricky. Then there are paths like Guzamaja that works with desire. And desire, even though it can be very powerful and we have to approach it with a certain kind of like I would actually say it should be supervised. You should do this under the supervision, under your own choosing, right? You choose who you want to supervise, but somebody who is competent, somebody who's experienced with this, somebody who has gone through that path, and then you subject and subordinate yourself that somebody else can keep an eye on you and say like, okay, you're going too far, you're going too fast, slow down, take a step, or like you're heading in a direction that's going to be unstable. I've been there, I knew it can lead to trouble. Please, take shift down, prepare yourself for it so that you can manage it. Don't just rush into things and then see what happens. For example, this is now the Guzamaja system. If you go into Vajra Bhairava system, for example, where you use the intensity of anger, again, if you don't do anything stupid, stupid means like you get angry and you punch a person. It's like that's not the solution. But if you are able to control yourself, then that same energy can become incredibly powerful. That can become, anger is one of the most, on one side, one of the most destructive forces if it's not supervised, if it's not managed. Right? That's most of the damage that we see in the world. It's either it's stupidity or it's anger usually. And the ones with stupidity is like an accident. People don't think through what's going to happen. Things are not, get out of control, cause problems. But when people are aggressive and put effort into, and they go the wrong way, then it gets very, very ugly, it gets very, very problematic. That's why it's so important to have a healthy outlook of like, okay, beyond one life, beyond just a little me, what happens, not just the friends and family around me, but what about the society? What about the future generations, downstreams, like 1, 2, 3 generations from now? Ideally, 7 generations is a good measure to think a little bit more downstreams. And then also, not just my friends and loved ones that I directly relate to, but they have more people that they relate to that I maybe don't know, and then they have more people, right? And so it becomes more like a planetary affair. And of course, in the background of this, from a Buddhist point of view, is always like you also want to consider the implications of your own future life, because whatever you do is not just about the love and care of others, but also the karma that is associated with it. So you ideally want to do something that is within the divine will. So the Buddhists, they have this concept of karma and dharma. Karma means you do something. It can be on an individual level, can be on a group level, can be a whole culture or species. Like there's different levels of karma. And then there's the dharma. And the dharma is like the way of nature, the way of God. Like what the Taoists would call the Tao. Like it is life sustaining, it is life affirming, it is divergent, meaning it's like it can go in many different ways, but there's an underlying harmony in this current. There's an underlying, like an organic arising of a particular, basically just of life, of configuration. This is a very healthy, a very safe approach to say like, okay, let me go back, let me regulate my nervous system, let me regulate my emotions, my mind, let me pacify everything, and then I get more and more calm, more and more clear, and then naturally serendipity and synchronicities end up just bubbling up almost by themselves, like without my doing. Just somehow the right thing comes in the right moment, and I don't even know why or how. Somehow I just stop interfering, basically, still being active and alive. Like that means I participate in the world, I do whatever I do, but I don't try to control, don't try to stop, I don't try to force things. And somehow, because I don't mess it up, somehow things just flow. And the metaphor that I like in this, it's not my own, I heard it from somewhere else. Many years ago, I'm trying to remember, maybe 15, 20 years ago. The idea of a cockpit. If you have a super new, like top of the class modern airplane, they can navigate pretty much anything by autopilot. They can adjust the height. They can be aware of other planes. They can be aware of storms. They have all the technology to basically get you where you need to get to. And these days, they could even take off and land if you would let them. We have legal reasons why we say humans need to do this, but for technical reasons you could do this, right? This is what we do with drones. Like there's nobody in a drone, and it's just a computer program, more or less, that of course, there's pilots that are supervising these things, but technologically we have a highly developed system that you could put on autopilot and it would just take care of itself. It would just be fine. And then it's us, the little me, that has its own hope and dreams and fears and worries and obsessions and who knows what. Things like, yes, never mind that natural divine program that would be running. Let me help it along by making it better. And then if that making it better is not first rooted, not founded in the understanding why this came to be the way it is in the first place, if I just say like, oh, we happen to go in this way, but now I want to go right. It's like, yeah, but do you understand why we're going in this direction? Because unless you can answer that question first, you're not in a position to evaluate whether you should change course. Because maybe we're just drifting in a particular direction and it's as good as any, and you can change from this direction to that direction. Maybe. But maybe we're deliberately trying to avoid a cliff over here, and we're deliberately going, and you now have an idea because you saw a shiny object, you want to go over there and it drives us over the cliff, right? So we have to be careful. This again, we need to come back to the foundation. What is it that we postulated fundamentally exists? What is the fundamental nature? How do we arise within it? How do we relate to it? How are we able to assimilate informations, usually coming through the sense organs? Again, we have, like when it comes to the first basic one, like the hierarchical order is like a linear order, like we had with the, you can take wealth or weight or size or age, or you can have a clear, either somebody is older than another person or is younger than another person. There's no maybe. There's not even two people that are exactly the same age. If you zoom in all the way, there was, however, then it becomes like how do you distinguish, right? It's like, let's take when you clip the umbilical cord. There's at least one, or the first breath is actually the one that is usually the one that matters. Okay, the one that breath goes in. One was slightly, it's like in a race. One is slightly, there is a linear order. But that's just for very, very trivial cases. If you simplify the world to a single criteria, you can always generate a linear order. But in most of the time, there's a trade-off or some sort of competing factors. Right? You want to be faster or stronger? Well, you can work to become more strong, but if you become very big, maybe you're not as fast anymore. Or you can train to be very, very, very fast, but if you only maximize for speed, maybe you would benefit by having more power, more strength, right? So just one example, there's of course many. And then the moment it goes into 3 dimensions, you start to have more complex relationships. It's not just trade-off, but it's like a structure that arises like in space, that we have shapes, that we have colors, that we have different experiences, that we have different flavors, and the different, in 3 dimensions, our qualities, our elements can relate to each other without necessarily relating through us, right? So I can have 2 friends, and they can have their own way of interacting with each other that I can participate with, or I can be outside of. It's not dependent on me. In 2 dimensions, you always have to go through a center, otherwise you lose. If you think, if you would trace a path, for example, in 2 dimensions, the path that self-intersects, if you cut it out, you separate it. Anytime you self-intersect, you basically cut yourself off. In 3 dimensions, I can have like a sausage that goes in one direction, goes away, goes up, loops around, goes behind, and then comes back. Right? It's like I have like a closed loop, uninterrupted, unintersected. Right? It's like, let's take a big donut of sorts, and then I can have a second donut that links through it, but it doesn't need to go through it. I can I can have as many closed structures that do not need to self-intersect themselves or each other. And then that is called braiding. So braiding is actually a technology that we use in quantum mechanics, or quantum computation more specifically, to take usually it's a charged particle, so it's usually an ion, usually it's not an electron by itself, it's an ion that with a magnetic field we learn to manipulate, and then we basically make, like braiding is like what girls do with their hair, right? That they braid them, they fold them together in a particular pattern. The same thing we can do with the path of particles over time. And then if you, again, it goes back to the chessboard things, you have either one way or another. You can go up and to the side, or first you go to the side and then up, but it's different because it's path dependent. The same is true with braiding. If you have a different way of braiding things, and let's say you take a snapshot, you walk away and you come back and you say, okay, now it moved from here, and there were a few points in between, and either it went around, either it went like let's say if you have 2 dots here, maybe you went around this way, maybe you went around this way, maybe you went zigzag around this way, maybe you evaded the first one and then the other one, right? You have different options. And you say like, well, okay, I didn't look, it doesn't really matter. You started in one place, you ended up in another place. Yes, but the thing is, the physical world, the physical reality remembers. The atoms themselves, they actually know, and you can do tests on this. There's experiments where you can reveal that nature actually knows, and this is something again that for quantum computation, more specifically for error correction, we use this. Right? It's like if something can be very easily squished and diluted and distorted, all you have to do is you start braiding things, and then it's like no matter how amount you stretch and compress, either the topological structure, the structure which is closed, will not change. This is actually the definition of topology. Sometimes it's called a sort of rubber sheet geometry, that you can stretch and twist and morph things around. As long as you can continuously transform it, then we call it, in a way, usually we call it isomorphic. I mean, it's like we just consider that to be the same class, all the descriptions that give rise to the same pattern, let's say. The same shape. Okay. Now, going back, I said I'm going to say a little bit more about working with these energies, because when you amplify the energy of desire, let's say, you better have the skill to handle it, and you also better have an idea of what to do with it. Let's say you have a big sailboat and there's a lot of wind, you better know where you want to go. Because if you don't know where you're going to go, and you're just like, okay, now I'm going to catch all this wind, to do what, right? These are not things to be done for stupid purposes. I don't even think it's very risky to do this for any kind of like only mundane worldly purposes. I would advise against it. Unless you have a very strong, firm anchor that is rooted in something transcendent. Again, breaking free out of the confines of one life, to having a higher understanding, to have your crown rooted and fixed in a realm that is beyond this world, from which you can draw inspiration and clarity and insight, and from where you can look at yourself. It's like, okay, here I'm just running away from pain, and here I'm just pursuing pleasure, and here I'm just, here I'm just being lazy, and here I'm doing this and that. Okay, all that, acknowledging all that, my preferences, my limitations, whatever it is, when I look at the situation, the right thing to pursue, where the effort should go, where the attention should go, where the action should go, is X, Y, Z. Whatever. Again, it comes down to your value system. But the religions in general, they tend to offer at least some framework for it. Now, there you need to distinguish between some of the religions say, okay, look, we're going to go for the supreme liberation all the way. Forget everything else. Don't get distracted. Don't get involved with family, with world, with money, with power. It's like, forget all that. That's just going to be prone to cause trouble and drama. Drop all that. Go into a monastery. Do vipassana. Do Theravada Buddhism. Do any number of practices that are essentially ascetic. That is perfectly valid. It fits with a particular temperament. It's not for everybody, and it surely is very limited as what you can do with the world, because those systems, they don't really, whatever energy there is like, okay, this is just an illusion, this is just mine. I don't, but I feel I feel a lot of compassion, let's say. It's just an emotion. You just name it, and ignore it, and keep going, right? That's an ascetic path. Whereas in other ways you can say, yes, but compassion is a very powerful force. It's something that you would want to cultivate. But the moment you cultivate an energy that has to do with manifestation, it comes down to, well, what are you going to do with it? Well, what is it going to be used for? How is it going to be managed? Or maybe more relevant for many people is the question of sex. Right? If you have an ascetic path, you can basically sidestep the whole issue by saying like, well, I'm not having sex, therefore everything is simplified. I don't even have to consider it. And then these systems very often have a limitation in the sense that they are not able to address that area of human life. Now again, in these systems, you have no need to go into those. Like, let's say if you go into a Christian monastery, what do you need to know about sex? You need to know about, you're not going to do it, finished. And then, you go all the way to God. So there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to deal with the world, if you want to interact, if you want to affect the world, if you want to develop something in the world, maybe you want to create something, maybe you want to share something with the world, maybe you want to be a positive force with the world, you need to have some sort of a system that allows you, that gives you an understanding of how to incorporate this. So this is from Theravada Buddhism, which is ascetic. Then you have Mahayana, or something called the Chinese Buddhism, and then derivatives from it. You have like Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism, and so on, or Taoism, or certain Hindu traditions, and many of the. See, the question is always, when you deal with energy, are you going far enough? Is it just going to be energy for the sake of energy, for the sake of excitement and power and who knows what? Or is it still going to be in this idea of the Sanatana Dharma, that it still should be a spiritualizing force? It still should be an element that helps you evolve, that assists you to develop, to grow, to refine, to become more spiritual, to become more pure, to become more elevated, to become more sublime, right? Are we favoring that? Or is it, again, the trap is to fall back down into one life, and then it's just about what I want and what I need and what I think is important and comfortable and convenient for me. And so spirituality begins when we are able to acknowledge that and transcend it in a way where the transcendent part is stronger than the limited part, right? It's not a problem that I have an ego, like my whole body is a manifestation of the ego. My immune system protects my body. If there's an infection or something, it will fight it, it will regulate all sorts of things. That there's all sorts of, from the digestion, from the regulation of the cardio and everything, right? The whole system essentially is an extension of my ego. So while I'll exist within this world, there will be some amount of ego which you cannot do without, at least on the lower levels. But what matters is your choices, and the basis for your action has to be able to rise above it and exceed those very limited constraints. And now again, just as an example, I'm not saying you need to go there, but those people who are disposed to tap into these energies, again, Vajrayana I mentioned, there's seems to be very limited traditions where this is being practiced actively on a day-to-day basis. Still very interesting philosophy and psychology that I think is underestimated today, how significant it is. Then Guzamaja to study desire, and then desire is still, while it can be very powerful, and you might run off a track if you desire something too much, you compromise on other things, like maybe you're not following through with things that you're supposed to, or you chose to, or said you would, because you get carried away with something and you don't control it. There is a risk. However, it's still, you're still desiring something, you're still kind of converging towards the goal. Whereas with Vajrabhairava, for example, when it's about power expansion, like an explosion, that force is very unstable and can go anywhere. And that really needs to be closely regulated, you know, like playing with fire, right? Yes, if you understand the parameters, if you don't have anything flammable around, or if you're out in a desert, or, you know, like nothing's going to go wrong, sure, you know, explore whatever you want. But just taking a lighter and setting things on fire and see which thing is flammable, you might set some, you know, what if the curtain is flammable? What's going to go from the curtain to where? And then something else, right? So with fire, which is the energy of anger, we have to be much more careful. And so a standard, for example, right, it's like there's always a way. We all have emotion. We all have sometimes challenging emotions, meaning that we get to a degree where we have to assert a certain amount of self-control to not lash out, to not do something that is immoral or act or just retort out of pain or something. We need to safeguard our conduct in general already. And then there are factors, sometimes external, sometimes also internal, that we amplify them, right? I think about something that makes me really upset and I get more upset, right? There's nobody else doing anything, it's just me doing that. And the more I think about it, the more I get, until I start fuming, right? It's like, that's not a very wise thing to do. But in principle, you know, if we could control the anger, we could use that. We can make ourselves very upset, and then using that energy where we feel very loaded, and say, okay, now I'm gonna, I don't know, I have to go chop wood to heat the sauna or something. Okay, and then you have something to do, and you can use that energy and channel it or something. But it's usually quite difficult to do, especially because the emotions then affect each other, and then the emotions, they are coloring the mind, and then the mind tends to go more in the direction of where the emotions are pulling. And if you can't control your mind, then certainly you cannot handle your mind riding on top of all these emotions. And so the standard in a Buddhist tradition, for example, would be, if you want to work with that, and you come in the most, something just happened, somebody really did something, you know, to upset you, and you feel completely justified to be angry. And then I tell you, it's like, yes, but okay, but now you need to drop it, and that other person, you know, I forgave that other person, it's fine, I told him it's okay, and now it's your problem. Okay, more likely than not, it's going to make you more angry, because now you're confronted with something you don't like, and then, you know, you focus on it, and it gets stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And then, let's say, just to push it a little bit, I'm not going to do it, but consider, what if then I slap you across the face for no reason, just to inflict pain or to humiliate you when you're already angry? It's just like, it will send you through the roof, like absolutely fusing. What the, you know? And then, in this total rage, when you're ready to, I don't know, throw everything at me, then there's like, stop. And you have to be able to completely, in the moment, on command, suspend everything. No matter the intensity, no matter the emotion, no matter the reason, like, not even think about it, just boom, stop. And if you can't do that, then you're not ready to work with this, right? Again, this is just from one tradition, one approach. It's like, if you can't handle it in the most intense scenarios, then, you know, we're not going to go there. You can't be trusted to manage certain powers if you're liable to go off the rails with it. So we need to be, in a way, humble when it comes to these type of approaches. It's important to understand what can be done in the world, and then again I come back to it's even more important to what we are favoring, what we are striving towards. What is the kind of the guiding star? What is the North Star, if you will, towards which we strive, for which we are orienting ourselves towards? And there, again, in this setting today, I use the idea of Sanatana Dharma, which I enjoy very much, just because it leaves the door open of any type of religion, like just this longing to be closer to oneself, to recognize God, to become more spiritualized, more elevated, and in an attitude towards love and service of something higher. And then, does it really matter what the person left and right, or what tradition that they follow, if we're all under the same sun, going in the same direction, favoring the same ideal? Like, no. Once we agree on the meaning, once we agree on the direction, ultimately in the highest sense, right? Maybe we have different philosophies of how we should manage our daily affairs. Again, I said some monasteries say like no sex, other people say like, well, I prefer to find a way to integrate that. Right? Okay, the logistics, how we go about it, that should be up to individual preferences. But as long as we can embed all of this in a common context, again, this has to do with cosmology. How did we find ourselves here in the first place? Teleology. How is this whole thing unfolding? Ontology, like what was fundamental? What was the most fundamental thing that we started out with? And based on that, what is the consequence, right? We have alpha in the beginning, but then there's also omega in the end. If there was a beginning, and I'm not saying like a big bang and a heat death, not like in a linear way, but in a way, if there is something, a most fundamental layer of what exists on one end, then what is the opposite end? What is on the highest, most all-encompassing? Again, if you want to consider many universes, then it's like, what about all the universes folded into one? What is that realm? Sometimes it's called Akasha, right? We translate Akasha as like the space element, because we think like, oh, no, we have the planet and then outside there's space. Okay, that's not wrong. That's one way how to see it. But Akasha is also sometimes considered the registry or the library of records of all your lives. And some traditions are like, because in some traditions it's possible that there's multiple parallel realities, and I mean, parallel means like you don't really have a simultaneity with things that are apart in space to begin with, right? There's already limitations of the speed of light and all that. But then you certainly don't have any simultaneity if you have a different branch of the universe which has its own time, right? That evolves completely independent of what we do here. But still, there is possibilities that you have different realms. The things can be played out, and therefore they generate, let's say, events. It doesn't necessarily need to be an effect, right? If you have a dream, you can have certain thoughts and generating a certain experience and make certain choices, and right? So it generates a kind of a story. Even though you can say, well, maybe that dream was entirely subjective. Like, yes, but it still happened within your consciousness. That means it's still within the realm of the divine consciousness, which is giving rise to all the different beings with all their hopes and dreams and visions and actions and experiences. Right? And so it's in this way that we then want to set out to say, well, then what is the highest that we can aim for? Because I'm sure we all have seen this, if not in ourselves, then surely with people around us, that many people often have high ideals of like, I know, I actually would like to do a retreat like this, or, I would like to study this, or I would like to practice this, or train, or whatever. But not right now, because right now I have this thing, and it's usually either something of the like more mundane things to do with security, food, shelter, family, those kind of things, that then they should be addressed. They should be on a good foundation, but it cannot be that everything in life just comes down to just trying to cater to the basics, right? Because you can always indefinitely acquire more and do more and have more children and have more houses and have more of everything, right? You can always fill up your life like that. But then what is the cost of that? What are you letting behind? Which is really, how much are you then catering to your soul? How much are you transforming yourself? How much are you evolving in comparison to what could be happening, right? Because if you have, for example, the Tibetan book of a disciple, Tibetan, what is it called? Is the yoga of a disciple? Something of a disciple. And it goes like, it has like lists. And it goes like chapter by chapter. It's like, okay, the 10 things to do, the 20 things to avoid, the things that identify merit, high accomplishments. It's structured like this, but it will go into things like, it will be a terrible waste if born in a healthy, free, and well-endowed human body. Means like in a way where you're not in slavery, where you're not owned or controlled by anyone else, where you have agency in your life, and you're healthy and free. Like healthy means like you have a healthy human body, you have arms, you have legs, you're able to interact, you're not a vegetable, you're healthy, you're free, and you're not exercising that to acquire, to accomplish, to arise to more of what you are, what you can be, and what you're meant to be, in the sense of like a spiritual merit, a higher level of realization, of establishment, to generate something that exceeds the limited view and becomes eternal, something that becomes ultimately something that is a vessel. Let's look, okay, all the physical things, the emotions, the pranic, the energies that I have, if I get strong, if I get fast, whatever, I'll have to leave those things with the body here. But when you think, not necessarily the knowledge that I acquired, but on the deeper levels, like the principles, the ideals, and the attitudes that are generated, that are established, that are being developed based on these higher ideals. An ideal doesn't change because you live or die, right? We still talk about Socrates and Plato and like all these, many of the authors that we talk about, some of them they've been dead for millennia, and we still talk of them because their ideal touched on something, because their solution, because their thought went to the core of something that made it relevant whether they are alive or not. So that means it no longer is tied to their one life, womb to tomb. But now we have something that goes beyond. And again, beyond means like, maybe somebody did something stupid, and even generations downstream, we still have to deal with consequences of somebody doing a stupid war or whatever they did. And the same thing is also true for some people that did remarkable things. Those are usually the ones that we call saints. Sometimes saints are a saint because they are just a perfection in terms of a human form, that they were simply being divine. And some of them, not all of them, some of them will have generated a system, will have generated thoughts, will have, let's say, Buddha has built up a whole system of frameworks of what to do and what not to do and how to practice. And he created a whole tradition. Ramakrishna never wrote down a single word. His disciples wrote down some of his words, but he himself never wrote. As far as I know, Osho also didn't really write. He gave a lot of speeches, and then these speeches were later translated or transcribed. So it's not implicit that because somebody is spiritual, that they need to do things in the world, or that they're not obliged to serve humanity, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't be free. Otherwise they would just be there as a slave to humanity. Now that they accomplished something, now they're obliged to give up their life and spend all the time that they have for others. It's not like that. But there is something like a calling, for some at least. It's not going to be the same for everyone, but some people will just be like, well, I just wish others could see what I can see. I wish I could share this with others. I would love to show others. Right? It's a very noble things to do, because very often we give up things for ourselves in favor of serving others, which is a wonderful thing to do. And then some people say like, okay, like I'm very grateful for the gift that I received. And when I look at the world, where the things are going, and whenever I try to encourage people to do a little bit less stupidity, to a little bit more morality, to a little bit more I just get attacked. So I say, you know what? If you know better, if you want to do whatever, you do you. I go away, leave me alone. I go to a mountain. Just don't come there. I won't come here. I can understand. I cannot say that I favor it, because on some level it is a little bit. I'm not going to go as far as calling it selfish, but it's like a limited option where more would be possible, because all these other people are just like you were. Like let's talk about a saint, right? Before the saint, or before the Buddha became enlightened, there was also many lives and many people who were also part of that journey to make that possible. So since one has come to fruition, it's a little bit like the like Swami would make this example with the bark and the flower of the tree. That the tree has actually, it's a very few grams compared to the whole tree, right? Whereas the trunk and the bark is very crude, very rough. The flower cannot say like, well, fuck the trunk. Like, well, the trunk just like bulk mass, and the crust around it is not even nice, doesn't even feel good. It's like, no, obviously the flower can only be the flower because it was a flourishing on the basis of everything that came before. And so it does seem that there is a kind of a natural again, it's not a responsibility, but like a natural contact, a natural relation to wanting to assist or being open to serve others. But again, I want to very clearly distinguish this from this humanitarian attitudes like, oh, we need to be useful and we need to be basically machines, and we're only justified that we exist because we do something good. Right? The basis for this is not that you are a human doing, the basis is that you're a human being. You are valuable because you are, not because you do. What you choose to do, that is up to you. And if you say, for now, I'm going to take a retreat for a week, for a month, for a year, for 3 years, right? Some of the people have done multiple of these 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks retreat. Some of them did 3 of them back to back, right? That means like pretty much a decade you're in the retreat. And that is something highly admirable. Now in this tension where we have worldly affairs, where people get caught up with their lives, with their families, with their financial securities and housing and all that, the question is, what would be possible to essentially afford humans that are inclined to spiritual practice? What would it really take, right? It takes some amount, for sure it takes food and shelter. It's just like to have an actual basis for a human existence. And then it will also be some practice facility. Usually it means you would want to have some community, some sort of supervision, somebody who is competent in that area, that can guide others, somebody who is more experienced. So I'm not going to shape it into any particular context, but to me that is a vision of, it's an optimistic vision, but it is something that would be possible to, what would it take to manage to afford the resources so that people can come together, study and practice, which in my opinion is actually the most significant one, which is the self-transcending part, which has to do with philosophy, which has to do with meditation, which has to do with spiritual realization, practice, and ultimately just generally a lifestyle that benefits ourselves, each other, and through which grace can flow. Because ultimately it's not about me training and accomplishing something myself. I do my part as an instrument, just like if I have a brush, the brush is stable so that I can deliver the stroke, right? If the brush is floppy or stretchy and goes all over how am I going to draw everything if it's just like right? I need to have some amount of structure so that grace can flow. And again, this is my point of view. Maybe comes more from the temperament of manipuristic attitude towards martial arts and this type of structure. I'm sure there are other ways, right? On Anahata, it's more like you love. Out of devotion, you love and you surrender, and then a force just drives you and calls you and compels you to go in a particular direction. Amazing. For worldly affairs, where people are at today, very often, from what I have seen, it's not so easy to start with that directly. Because most people are somewhere what we call Svadhisthana energy, right? It's the second chakra to do with polarity, with confusion, with I want this, I don't want that, I'm emotional about this. It's like, okay, like with a child, sometimes there's turbulences, sometimes there's difficulties. The question is, how can this be channeled in a healthy channel to develop, to refine, to smoothen out and polish, refine, transform, transmute, and ultimately, right, it's like from the caterpillar into the butterfly. At the end, you are something else. But you don't ever stop being yourself. You just are one way, and then there's a process of transformation. You remain yourself, your limited self, and eventually you become a new refined version where something else is pervading you. And while there are many ways how that can be accomplished, I'm entertaining one with regards just kind of looking at the world, looking at some of the challenges, some of the limitations, some of the dynamics, where I believe, yes, maybe it is possible to, even on a virtual level, to create something like a digital artifact, like to have like atoms. I'm not going to call it an atom of consciousness, but an atom for interaction. And then that atom, that piece, would have to be like a you can think of it like a document, but with digital documents we can easily copy paste them back and forth. I believe that is not good enough, because with a physical document you have bearer documents. A bearer, right, means the one who holds the document actually owns it, like getting physically hold of the document is the physical ownership of whatever, right. For example, this is again, maybe this varies from country to country a little bit, but usually you have some booklet that goes with a car or a vehicle. And in that booklet it says the owner of this vehicle, basically it gives you the ownership of that vehicle. And in many countries, if you actually get that booklet of somebody else, then you own it. Let's say if there's a car and I get the booklet from one person, now technically I own, of course, right? It's like if I obtain this illegally just because I stole it, doesn't mean that now I illegally own the car. It doesn't work like that. But it's basically the document which gives you, as a bearer, gives you the right. The same thing could be said with bearer bonds and all sorts of things. In a similar way, it would be possible to have digital certificates where a digital record of sorts gives you, a document. A document is just a piece of information that registers a bunch of, details, let's say. But it could be, I'm not advocating it in this format, just as an illustration, right? It could be an Excel spreadsheet where you have like a certain credit, a certain, like a balance, where you say like, okay, you have this amount of credits, and you've used within these documents, you've been using them to exchange and trade and interact with all sorts of other entities, right? That you kind of, let's say I have a document, you have a document, and then I take 10 points of mine and I give them to you, and maybe you give me 5 points of some other points back in exchange, and then I register them in my documents, and you have the reciprocal copy on your end. This may sound like an unusual way to go about it, but the reason for this is that I deliberately was looking for some approach that is not dependent on some global frame, because just like I said, there's technical reasons for this, and we can go into that if there's interest. But just like the way I said that there is no notion of what it means at the same time when things are apart, this only gets exacerbated when things then interact and then you have this delayed choice. Like, okay, I get from here to there and there's a tree in between, and either I walk away one way around the tree or the other way around the tree. Okay, it doesn't matter which way I go because I just want to get to the other destination, so I can kind of ignore the thing. And yet, historically then it matters because either I did go around one, because I had to get from one place to another, like there's continuity, like with topology, the things are connected. And I don't want this to be artificially imposed, because in my opinion actually most of at least the scale of the trouble that we're having is because we have a lot of inadequate tools, that we have over idealization to do, starting with flat space and regularity of time, and that we can just use real numbers to chop things down to 500,000 decimal places. It's not realistic, right? And just because we pretend it's like that, just we can pretend that there's simultaneity, it doesn't mean that nature actually runs like this. And to the extent that we have a model that is not able to adequately reflect reality, simply because it's too crude, it will cause distortions, it will cause defects. But these defects are very hard to see because the model will be self-consistent. The model will keep telling you this is the right thing to do, and this is where you're at, and this is where you're going, and this is what you can do, and this is what you should prioritize. And meanwhile, the physical reality may be only partially covered by that model. One example is anything that you offload as waste or garbage, right? You just get rid of it, and therefore it's no longer part of your model, but it actually affects the rest of the world, whether it goes into the atmosphere or into the water or into the soil or wherever it goes, right? So you can't really separate yourself from the environment, and that's why these over-idealized scenarios are not possible. Like, not possible, like as a thought experiment we can do whatever we want, but they're not realistic, they're not related to reality in the way that we need them to be. We need something that is organic in terms of the structure, that it can arise locally, that is open, because that's how we understand the universe to be. We don't know whether there is a limit or there is no limit to the universe. We just know that there's a horizon as to how much and how far we can see. And beyond that, we don't know. There may be ways to go beyond what we know, right? We say like, oh, you know, we don't know, we can't go faster than the speed of light, let's say. Okay. Let's assume that that is a limitation of physical reality. You cannot move through space faster than the speed of light. Okay. But then there's still the question, how did you get where you ended up in the first place? Like, did you really historically end up there simply because you have like a, I don't know, a birth certificate or something that attests that you were born? Or is there another way? Let's say if you branch reality and then you have two copies of the universe, or two, even if it's just as a thought experiment, hypothetically, then you didn't get born again, but somehow you created a branching, you created a copy, a replica. And so if you can create a copy this way,
you've cut out again. If you can create a copy this way,
Recording stopped.
okay, now you can hear me again. Okay, I have a little bit of a shaky connection here with the power. I hope it holds.
Yeah.
We'll see.
I paused the recording, so.
Okay.
If you can create a copy this way, and 3, 2, 1.
Recording in progress.
So if you can create a copy by branching, either going left around the tree or right around the tree, you kind of, at least psychologically, you create a copy. The same thing you could say when you go into a dream. You are there, you have some body, you have some story of how you got there, but where did it come from? Because it wasn't caused historically, it was just something that your mind, your subconscious kind of generated through the lens, through the apparatus of your mind, you project a reality. Now, what is really the limit to that? In principle, could you give rise, if your mind is powerful enough, could you give rise to an entire universe? And then what principles would be applicable to that universe? Like how would that universe, even if you change principles, how would it relate to this one? Because if you're saying you're giving rise to it, you're still somehow relating to it. That means there still needs to be, even if let's say you make a universe where humans can fly, for example. Okay, fine. But that still means you subjectively have to be able to relate to what it means to be subject to gravity and somehow to, I guess, overcome gravity or not be affected by gravity, or however that's right. There's gonna be a relation to that, and exploring all that just expands the space, but it doesn't answer the question who and what I am, like not in terms of like an individual level with like biographical details with like birth date and name and all these things. Like, no, we're not. That's just part of manifestation. But on a deeper level, the sense of I am, the sense of existing, how did this arise? What is it originating out of? What is it? What is its nature? Because if I, instead of just looking at the world as like all the things I want and don't want and try to pursue or try to run away from all the things in the world, the background of this, like this background awareness, has actually nothing to do with the world. Because if the whole world disappears, if the whole universe disappears, that background awareness is there. Because it's that background awareness that gave rise to the whole universe in the first place. And so, in this vision of Sanatana Dharma, of having this eternal religion, with the question, okay, that would be a nice goal. That would be something worth pursuing. How do we resource an endeavor, like a garden, where people can come together that want and study, practice a tradition that favors, that supports, that assists their spiritual evolution, while we exist in a reality as it is today. That means we have states, we have laws, we have mediums of exchange like currencies, we have legal systems, we have financial infrastructure. Wouldn't there be a way how we can interface with that reality and offer that reality something that maybe is out of reach? Right? In Taoism, the idea is often to connect to the universe and condense something, to collect something subtle and condensate it until you give it a form, like a material, a tangible, I don't know. The most basic level, think of it like a piece of information. You take a picture of the universe and you calculate something, you measure something, and then you can write down a piece of it. It's a very crude way of thinking about it. But in the same way, what if there would be a way to access things, like today, for example, we have issues with data degradation, right? That disks, for example, hard disks or wherever you store data, if you don't have backups, it's always possible that one of them breaks and you can't recover it, or that you can recover it only incompletely. But what if information would be like these topological rings, that it would be self-describing and closed, that it would always be able to recover, that you always would be able to reconstruct, to self-heal, that the information, that the whole way of not just the data, but also the way that it is applied. Like when you think in terms of like autopilots or programs that are performing a certain functions, usually it's like we build a machine and we take the machine, let's say we make a robot like a lawnmower and we tell it to chop down the grass. Okay. And then we walk away and it just keeps chopping. It gets further and further and further. And at some point it starts chopping down flowers. Like, wait, that's not what we intended to do. We just wanted to do lawn maintenance. We didn't actually want to kill the whole garden, right? And if we build a machine, then that machine is disconnected from consciousness and it's just running like a mechanism. That's not necessarily a good or a safe thing to do in the long run. Right? It's useful for some things. Yes, we can have mechanisms to do also. To have like a coffee machine. I push a button, makes a coffee. Sure. But in the long run, it's better to have things that are not only in contact with us and are calibrated, but somehow, ideally, that you can convey the idea of what it is to be upheld, to be maintained, to be generated, to be cultivated. Again, in this Sanadana Dharma, it would be to go in a direction of bubbling up, of giving rise to spiritual merit. Of course, it can go in many different directions, but I believe one of the most fundamental things that we kind of lack today is a notion of stability, because today we only have stability by attaching to something else, that we say, okay, the shore is stable and therefore we attach to that, or the floor is stable underneath the river and therefore we dig a pillar in there. But that's we can import stability, for operational purposes. Yeah, it's fine to build bridges across a river and it works. But on a larger scale, on a global scale, these sort of approaches don't really hold. We need to have things that are intrinsically stable, that are yielding stability from within, that don't draw it from outside. So intrinsic means, like, for example, if you take a triangle, this is Julian Barber points out these sort of things, angles are intrinsic. Like, if you know the angles of a triangle, that triangle is perfectly defined. The size of it is completely arbitrary. Arbitrary means like it's an extrinsic fact. It's something that only is relevant with regards to other things, not with regards to itself. The angle is something that it can describe within itself. And the same thing can be applied for stability. Again, we have the gyroscope, the gyro effect. There's gyro stabilizers. I don't remember the upper end there. They're like I think they're like 1,000 tons or something like that. There's like insane machines, like big machines that are spinning. I don't remember. Or are they spinning like this way? Maybe. Yeah, I think that they're spinning the long way of a boat, or maybe they have to be crossway. I don't remember. But like big boats, because so they don't roll around with the waves. They have a kind of like a spinning disc, much like a grinder. This machine that you can use to grind and cut things. It has a spinning disc, and then that generates an intrinsic stability. Now, this stability is simply a mathematical relationship that you have an axis, like I described, the measurement axis, and then the perpendicular plane. So whenever you have measuring the momentum along one axis, where is the energy of that momentum? Mathematically, we just say like, well, it's in the perpendicular plane because it grows quadratically. Like, as you have, let me see a bit more. Like if you have the vertical, which is one line, and then you have the horizontal, which is the entire plane. So if you measure the vertical, whatever energy you have, it's just one single line. There's no energy in that line, but mathematically we say it's packed into the perpendicular dimension. So we can model these sort of things, and we could give rise to a supply that is being regulated, just like a gyroscope, that you can add energy, that you can accelerate, speed it up, slow it down, and whatever mass you have, you add more mass spinning, it becomes stronger, becomes more stable. You add more energy, it will become more powerful, more strong. Strong in a sense that if it gets displaced, if something pushes against it, it can counterbalance more. Right? Let's say if you've been in a rowing boat, for example, if you're by yourself in a rowing boat, maybe you're good, maybe you're stable, but maybe it takes very little and you lose balance. If you stand up, it gets very unstable and you fall. If you have another person in there who's maybe more heavy than you and is better at their balance, they can stabilize the whole thing because they can compensate for whatever thing you're doing, and then they can offer you, in a way, their stability, and you can become more stable by inheriting. You're not taking stability away from them because they are already stable, and as an effect, they yield stability. the same thing could be possible for making up a currency, for example, because today we say, currency is a currency stable if it maintains the exchange rate with another currency. But that just means basically all the currencies that we have, more or less, with some mechanisms to dilute one or the other, they pretty much they behave like one currency. Like if you think of it in terms of their dimensions, they're all oriented, measuring the same thing. And so they're more similar to each other than they're different. Just, yes, some of them are being inflated more than others, but in terms of the day-to-day, the volatility, they're not really. Yeah, to me, it's a lot like a bunch of people going skydiving and all jumping out of the plane and then looking at each other while saying like, oh, you're floating up a little bit, you're flowing down a little bit. That's like, yeah, but that's not really the correct reference system. The reference system is that we're all going down, and if something would be stable, in this example, stable would be the plane, because the plane can keep the level while everyone else jumps out. That would be an interesting reference system. So how do we generate stability? How do we generate an internal stability that is robust, that can be upheld in an open system that doesn't require any top-down imposition of force, but something that can be booted up from the bottom up and give rise to a structure in a way that you could also, if it's open, that means you can also create a partition. You take it apart into maybe a larger piece or a smaller or many different pieces. They should be able to maintain locally. This is why the idea of a bearer right, that you have that all the activities, all the changes, all the modifications, transactions can happen locally. And anytime you come back together, you can compose multiple pieces together and give rise to a larger structure where then everything is nicely integrated. And the way it is set up, it's just like if you take certain whole number modular arithmetics, there are branches of mathematics that are internally self-consistent and in a way that you can easily bring things together, and you always know how to relate them to each other. Right? There's no ambiguity of sorts. That no matter what the different people want, what they think the world should look like, there's a kind of a basis where everyone agrees, like, okay, but 1 is 1 and 2 is 2 and 0 is 0. Like in a sense of like we have like a common language or a common codex, which allows us to interrelate not only accounting mechanisms, not only arithmetic in terms of multiplications and division and partition and all that, but also its dynamics. Again, this is why I wanted to have a strongly connected theory, a strongly coupled theory, that we have a continuous transformation, not just like snapshot from previous to after, but the whole transformation in between. Okay, you have a bunch of buckets, you throw balls in it, you have a different distribution, you have pre-state, like previous state, post-state, the after state, and in between, like the thing with the going one way or another way around tree, there is some form, some way, maybe there's multiple ways, but at least one of them has to be selected, how the balls from the distribution in these different buckets, how they get redistributed, which one moves from where to where, and then we end up in the state after. And in the same way, we can come together, generate a certain, create basically a contract. It means a contract means just like an agreement on the recipe, on how to set up, how many of these different pieces that we come together to recognize. It doesn't mean that anyone, right? Again, I'm very much favoring an open system. These things should be open, that it's not, it shouldn't stop anyone from in an isolated island somewhere out in the ocean. They should still be able to make use and apply the same principles. But if we want to federate, if we want to come together, and this is also the principle of fusion, that you always have, when it comes to stability, for example, if you have multiple elements that offer stability, a composite system will always be more stable than its components, right? Even let's say you have the biggest stabilizer, will still have an advantage to join, to link up, to build an alliance with a second one, as that their joint stability to increased mass and increased energy will exceed what they could ascend to, amount to, aspire to. And one thing that you mentioned right at the beginning, Luke, was about Napoleon Hill. Napoleon Hill wrote several books, but I think um, one of the more central ones is called the Mastermind Method. Sometimes it's called the Mastermind Keys. I think there's YouTube videos where it's like 13 parts, and there's a few present from many years ago, many decades, black and white. But the thing, the way he thinks, the way he sees things, I believe is there's a lot of value to in general for people to understand that kind of outlook on the world, on life. And then also for practical purposes, what he says, what he advocates is for people to come together and forming a mastermind group. Or even there's even I think something called like a mastermind alliance. Something if you go on YouTube, Napoleon Hill and Alliance, there's also going to be a video directly dealing with that. And so it would be a nice vision if we say, okay, given we start in the world as things are, upholding a vision for an ideal future, like, again, I made the case of why don't we strive to afford as many people as possible to have the proper channel, the proper engagement, the proper resources, the proper setup to devote their life and their time and their energy towards a spiritual practice. Because not many people are actually not interested in that. And the ones that are interested a little bit, they should do a little bit. And the ones that are interested a little bit more should be, why not do more? But there are some people that are just absolutely burning for it, and they don't want to do anything else night and day. And then that should be enabled. I know it's enabled for Vipassana, like Vipassana centers tend to be generally free, right? That's part of their idea, their code. I believe this could also be expanded into additional, like a wider range of practices, including Taoist practices and tantric practices, and certainly yoga, which of course yoga is also possible within the ascetic path. But if you really want to start working with energy, it's better to have like a support structure that is also able to guide and offer, I don't know, like diagnostics, feedback, insight of how to correct, how to, it's always wherever you are, no matter how optimistic you want to think of yourself, it's still a wise idea to have somebody that you consider to be more advanced than you to supervise you and give you feedback. And like you can start out with like say like, okay, it's like a spiritual friend, and we talk, and we maybe sometimes I take advice, or maybe we debate something, maybe I agree, maybe I disagree. Okay, fine. But ultimately, if it's about you or me, for me to transcend myself, if I want to go beyond where I can go myself, how am I going to get there? Either I'm randomly trying things and eventually figure it out, okay, or I listen to somebody who is able to see more, who knows more. And I'm let's take the example of climbing. I'm like, oh no, I can't do this. And somebody else who's more competent than me and can evaluate my situation and knows my own ability says like, no, I know you can do it. And now I just need you to focus. Don't think what you can and cannot do. Just look up, and there is this one rock. And like a thing that stands out a little bit. And I know it seems weird, and it seems like you might fall. But I can tell you, if you really stretch and then pull yourself up, you can reach that, and then you can make it to the next step, right? By myself, maybe I would do many random things and stupid things and fail in 15 different ways. But if somebody can instruct me what to do in the situation, what the correct thing is to do, even if emotionally I feel like, yeah, but I'm scared, or I feel like I can't do it, okay, but I can draw from the confidence, from the inspiration, from the faith, from somebody who's actually competent and knowledgeable about this, right? But it doesn't mean we should just like randomly promote my pet and then say like, okay, my pet is now my guru and I'm going to do whatever my pet says. No, obviously this should be an informed decision of somebody that we admire, and also it's perfectly justified when you say, okay, I'm following one person. In a sense, I'm giving them the authority to command, or if you don't like that command, encourage, direct, instruct me to essentially help me overcome my own limitations. It's perfectly sense. Like, okay, well, where is your source? What tradition are you drawing from? Who has been your teacher? Who are you listening to? And then you can see whether you're satisfied with that authority that then somebody's offering to you, where you're just like, okay, this seems that person that seems to be having hand and feet, and I can actually fully trust my life and my whole well-being placed in the hand of that person, and I know I'll be taken care of well, then you're very fortunate. Then you're in a very good position. If that is not a possibility, yes, maybe you can learn skills and competences from others that you can look up to because they have specialized in an area that you have not developed yet. There's also value in that, but then it becomes again more significant to come back to the most fundamental question. Why is there a universe? How did we get here? Where are we going? What do we postulate that fundamentally exist? And how are we able to discern and evaluate all these answers? And this is then what gives rise to epistemology through the different principles by which we either have a linear order, or we have trade-offs, or we have color and like multi-component qualities. We have three-dimensional space. Then we have dynamics, how things change over time. Then we have alternatives like possible pasts or probable pasts. Right? Sometimes it's not entirely clear. If you go far enough, it's no longer that certain what exactly happened 2 billion. Yes, we have some models what happened 2 billion years ago, but like how many assumptions go into. The further you go back, the more vague it becomes. And the same thing for the future, right? With the future, it becomes a bit more apparent because we can interact with the moment, and therefore we can affect the future. So we have not just dynamics in the sense of like whatever happens, there's an impulse that keeps rolling, but I can also intercede, I can interrupt, I can change, I can adapt, I can add to the impulse, and then in a larger way, beyond all these different alternatives, we have a realm of all the possible timelines, all the possible paths, all the possible alternative presence, right? Even, let's say a presence of a planet in another galaxy. It exists now. In principle, there could be human life or some form of life there, right? That's also something that at least is within the realms of possibilities. And then within all those realms, anything that could be one way or another way, like we have 2 arms, 2 legs. Is it being human, is it really limited to that? Yes, here, yes. On this planet, yes. But would there be a possibility to have a human-like experience in a
You've cut out completely now. We've gone to a.
Recording stopped.
Can you hear me, Fab? Wait. Yeah, you're back now.
Yes, I did hear you. I just know that. Oops! Now everything's fucked up again.
Cool.
Yeah, this time it was the camera. See, maybe like this. Yeah, this time was the camera that ran out of battery, so I couldn't even respond.
Get ready to go?
Yeah. Oh, now I'm a bit off center, I see. Let's see. Maybe like this.
Very good, very handsome. 3, 2, 1.
Oh, are you? Okay.
Recording in progress.
So, sorry we had a quick interruption with a power issue. Let me move one thing. Just noticing now. Yes, so yeah, that was kind of like going towards the end. I wanted to wrap up this idea of, yes, it's good to have inspiration and some sort of supervision. You are free, of course, to choose your own authority, but it is not exactly why. It's like if you want to get to the top of a mountain, why don't it's much more efficient to listen to somebody who has made it, who's been there, who can tell you how to get there, and who knows their own way to get back there anytime they want to, as opposed to, it's like, okay, many people these days, like, I'm my own guru and I'll find my own way. It's like, okay, good luck with that. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just going to be a lot of trial and error along the way, whereas somebody who has figured something out can offer you a lot of guidance and insight. Again, this current vision that I'm advocating is, let's aspire to a shared universal ideal where people can engage in spiritual practice, and what does it take to afford a decent amount of people. Again, it's something that can be built up gradually, but ultimately a vision where people can study and practice different flavors, different traditions, just whatever their heart is calling them for, to go into it. How can we then, that vision, relate to the situation that we are in today? We have the financial and legal systems as they exist. How can they be related to? How can we connect to them? How can we interact with them in a way that shields, that limits their sometimes corrosive tendencies, right? Sometimes they have tendencies to corrode, meaning like favoring deviation from what is ideal. How can we stabilize that? How can we go towards self-calibration, self-correction, self-healing already on the basic things of how we arrange data, how we arrange relationship, how we set up just the general orientation of interaction, activity, study, practice, just to have a naturally conducive life, like with this, the way of God, this Tao, this eternal Dharma, this Sanatana Dharma, and its manifestation. And for practical purposes, I like the format of the mastermind group, where people come together, like Napoleon Hill advocates, to become excellent and to support each other, and to yes, that like whatever I already discovered, I can offer it to others, and others will have learned and know other things that I haven't known yet, and we can support each other. And it's more than just we're exchanging ideas and updating each other, and we're just become the sum of our parts. But there's, when you come together for a shared purpose and a shared goal, then there's something more that comes through. There's something more that arises. And again, I didn't want to go too much into the technical details, but yes, there are ways of having like bearer instruments, and then having like a local registry. Like you can all do this kind of arithmetic, and you have like a recipe, like an agreement of like how these things are set up together, and then you for example, you author a common virtual pool for like this spinning example that I made with the gyro stabilizers. This is just like a concept, just a model. But then you can branch it out into multiple components, right? If we have fusion, that multiple pieces can come together, we can also decompose them into separate parts, separate islands, right? Carl Sagan used to call the galaxies island universes. So that means that would be one place to start, that we say one unit is one galaxy. And then you have many different whatever it is, like 100 trillion galaxies or something, maybe more. And then every one of those has like 100 trillion stars. So one approach would be, well, maybe this gets a bit much if we open that subject now, but with intersubjectivity, the question is, are you in my world or am I in your world? Because if we just say like, oh, we're just in the world of somebody else, that doesn't really solve the issue, because to me, it seems everything else appears in my world. But I'm also aware that everyone else has their own view where they perceive everything, including me, to be in their world. It's not a hierarchical order that everything is subordinated into my world and then they have their own worlds. It's not like that, right? Because they would see themselves, they would see it the other way around. So it's a non-hierarchical recursion, like a reflection, or like a reflective relationship where I can relate to others and those others can be related back to me. So that means ultimately it is holographic, which is how the universe appears to be, at least through the human conditions. As far as we can see, at the minimum, it's holographic. Maybe it's all sorts of other things, but for sure, it's holographic based on how we perceive space and time and can take pictures and model things. And there's a lot of implications with that, including like that you need to have models that you can decompose and recombine. That requires exact arithmetic. That means you cannot deal with like these over idealizations like real numbers and that kind of stuff. But you always need to have a constructive approach. That means constructive in terms of the setup, constructive in terms of mathematics, and in terms of the philosophy for physics. Surprisingly, David Bohm's pilot wave theory, so sometimes called the Broglie-Bohm pilot wave, which is quite different from what is commonly presented when you just learn about quantum mechanics. It's usually one of the theories is a little bit on the side, but it has very interesting, very down-to-earth, simple approach. It's very sober. I heard this from Tim Modlin, that he says that Bell actually said that this is the best constructed theory. It's not his own theory, but he said about de Broglie-Bohm that that's from the ones that are available, that's the best constructed theory because it's a constructive theory. It's not just like a recipe that helps you do arithmetic, but it gives you an affirming view on the world where you can model all the possible futures, but then what you filter down is the component which is real, which is always singular. You know, kind of like if you drive a train, you can drive the train any track you want, but you can only ever pick one track at a time. You cannot simultaneously end up in multiple places. So potentially of the future, you behave as they are all simultaneously real to some degree, and then you integrate that whole caboodle, you derive a consequence, and based on that consequence, you then either go left or right, and so on. Anyway, I think that was a lot we covered today. I don't know what else is there, if there are any more ideas or inputs, what else to go into, but I think we roughly covered the content that was in the message.
Well, yes, we covered quite a lot. And then also, obviously, quite not a lot. But I think if we can kind of come back to the and tie it in, how these ideas are connected back to the basic ideas of wood, fire, earth, metal, water.
Yes, so this...
How it all ties together, essentially.
So, from the Potter's box, if you give self-consistent, internally consistent and self-referentially complete answers to these possible assumptions, they give rise to certain principles, and there's actually a limited amount of those that are possible, and they start, the most basic one is the one of stability, linear order. The second one is liquidity. So the epistemological principle, they naturally end up showing up from examining your own assumptions. And then for practical purposes, then if you create an artifact like a digital certificate, that would be the thing which is more stable. The moment you allow relations among multiple of these elements that can transact, that can trade, then you have dynamism, then you give rise to order, then you have fusion, then you have models where you have projections, right? Something that you project over time. Means you also you're also dealing to give rise to a notion of time and space, because you can't just import the Greenwich Mean Time, which is kind of like a clockwork that we impose on the world, because the world is expanded in space. And while for everyday human purposes it's okay to say like it's this hour or this minute and this second, when it comes to high precision and high frequency, exactly the kind of exactness that we need, they are no longer sufficient. So then means you from the data, within the data structure itself, you give a rise to a notion of time, like progression of transformation, an ability to rescale, that you don't are caught up in this fantasy of having like a universal scale, because if distance and like distance is measured with the speed of light over time, if time is not fundamental, then certainly distance can't be fundamental. Geometric relationships can be, but then the question is, how do you relate scale? Then it means the scale is kind of like a derivative from complexity. So there will be some technical areas in that, but ultimately it comes from having simple assets that you can transact with, that you can have interaction with, that you can have relations, that you can have exchanges or flows like a current, that you can have higher level organizing structure, the pieces can come together and federate. And then the model that project into the future, that you project the dynamics, you project trajectories, you project energies, you project dynamism. And then from there, we then have kinetic energy, and then all of that arises essentially in a data model that can, I affectionately, I like to think of it as a kind of a Byzantine Everett. That's because what Bitcoin has solved, like blockchain, the original Satoshi paper, it's quite well established and recognized that it solved the Byzantine generals problem. Like how do you handle a situation where you have competing parties and all of them may lie and defect and cheat, and so, which you can't really rule out, and so you have to find a way that the right data is preserved, even if people are trying to mess with the system, that there's a certain integrity that cannot be compromised. I'm expanding this one and saying like, yes, but we don't just want to be locking us in on a single timeline, because that's actually not realistic, because we know this from experiments and from not just thought experiments, physical experiments, that these different paths, these path dependence, that they interact with each other. So we need to make possible, we need to be comfortable that all these alternative possibilities at least have some degree of realism, some degree of reality, and as such we cannot just solve the Byzantine generals problem on a single track, but we need to be able to cater to the entire spectrum of all possible universes, which then takes us to Akasha, which is actually quite interesting. When you write Sanskrit, first thing you do is you draw a line, it's called to draw the Akasha, and then all the characters kind of get tied, like it's kind of like above the letter or in the upper part of the letter. It's not a line on below that you write on, but it's like a string that you string across, and then you kind of strap a different thing. And this is a way to view it, that basically the highest principle, like within these elements, the ether, the fifth element, the quintessence, is the one that really prevails in the background, and then within that we deal with stabilities like assets, titles, resources, transactions, transformations, currencies, regulations of supply, elastic supply, forces to then, first federating together, generating larger patterns, and then over time coming together, giving a common shared notion of time.
You've cut out again, mate.
Recording stopped.
Try again. Speak again.
It should work, right? Check. 1 2 1 2.
Receiving.
Okay. So we're nearing the end of all the
Recording in
backups.
progress.
So you give rise to a model that basically prevails like space, but like a conceptual space, like a kind of like a background canvas that exists regardless of which galaxies and which universe, and all this invariant over all of that. But it offers you an arithmetic. It allows you to have a way of, kind of counting beans and making interactions based on how many beans are in which buckets and which way they rotate around. And then that is invariant of any particular configuration of who participates, of whether it's small, whether it's large, but it's something that stands in the background. And in a way, sometimes the question is there, is mathematics something that we create or something that we discover? And I believe that a lot of it is like a kind of ingenuity that we come up in a creative way to express one thing and another, but there is the deeper reality that there is a background that simply exists. You like it or not, you study it or not, It simply is there. It is there to explore by humans or by any other intelligent species. Like the moment you have dimensions, for example, when you have a sphere, this is something that Ed Witten said in an interview with Closer to Truth, I think. It's like any species that has a concept of space, like three-dimensional space, will arrive at the question. It's like, well, how, if you have a sphere, how do you relate the surface to the volume? And invariably, that will take you to some form of geometrical algebra and some sort of calculus. Maybe you call it differently, maybe you have a different way of handling it, but the relationship between volume and surface is something that invariably arises. And so in the same way, I would say we should aspire to give rise to a solution that is in support of this Sanatana Dharma, this wider, larger, deeper vision of spiritualization and how it's possible for humans to participate and be elevated in that. And then within that we see, okay, what kind of mechanisms, there's all sorts of computational extensions that we can then make the life more easy, more natural, more elastic, but we need to substitute some of the building blocks of, like, you know, the all this stuff that we learn in high school with like Euclidean geometry and Cartesian coordinates. It just corrupts people's brains because then they think that the world is like that. The world, we know the world is not Euclidean. We know that the Cartesian coordinates are not applicable on a global or on a universal level. It's just like something that is Newton mechanics. It is good enough to drive cars and to throw baseballs, but it's not good enough for it to be a foundation of physical or even a philosophical framework. And again, to have the earth at the center psychologically for humans, to start is like, hey, I'm standing on ground, I'm human, let's start with this is the center of the universe, is not technically wrong. You can explain everything by epicycles upon epicycles, but it's more interesting if you start with the moon, for example, and then build it up from there. And then, of course, you need to be able to relate and translate for all the other framings that we have, and they really are framings, right? Nobody said that these epicycles is wrong. People just said, like, well, if you put the sun in the center, that makes it more simple, more convenient, more intuitive to understand. It's a simpler picture, and therefore it's better due to its simplicity. But in terms of its implication, I like to start with the moon, the earth element, then we go to the earth with the water element, then we go to the sun with the fire element, and then the natural consequence will go to the center of the galaxy, the Milky Way, Sagittarius A star, the center, supermassive black hole, roughly 75% from our distance from the earth to the sun. So it's like a massive black hole that is incredibly big, like huge, would almost reach out to us, like 75%. And then yes, beyond the galaxy, like all the galaxies exists within the universe that we know, and then beyond that is also beyond the universe that exists is all the universes that could exist, right? And so that's the idea, to tap into that level of universality, like mathematics, something that is there, invariable. You know about it, you don't, it's simply there. Why don't we just tap into that and draw energy and resources and insights and structure from there, the same way that somehow nature, including biological organic nature, somehow seems to be consistent with some of these principles. That's how we learned about them in the first place, right? It's because humans studied their own nature, their own reality, their own experience, and the nature around them. That's how we got to philosophies, because people tried to make sense of who and what they were. So there's no surprise that then when you get a more coherent understanding of the universe at large, that then you say, like, oh, okay, now we know where all these higher principles are coming from. Let's find a way how to, like a path of grace. How can we optimally channel essentially the heaven to infuse all the human souls and all the sentient beings so that they can evolve more smoothly, more effortlessly, more gradually, more joyfully, and thus, you know, we join together to walk each other home.
I think that's a beautiful place to end today. Let's walk together to take each other home.
Yes, so
That's what you said.
Yes, it's what Einstein said, that when he went to Princeton, because he really did his greatest work in his younger years, and then later on, at least he didn't publish much of it. I think he did quite a bit more, but what we know of him is mainly from his early years, and then he commented once about his time at Princeton. He's like, yeah, I was mainly there to walk home with Kurt, like Kurt Gödel, the logician. So I don't know. I like that, and it's a nice vision in general for on a spiritual path, that if we're all striving and longing to go for the same highest reality, we might as well join up together and assist and support each other to get there in a more light, in a more joyful, in a more playful way, right? It could be exciting, could be fun. It can be work. It's one angle that we just make effort and discipline. One philosophy. Another one is through pleasure. Another one is through joy. Another one is through different types of actions, different types of meditation. So yeah, I like this view.
That will be the name of our episode. This episode. Very good. And same time, same place next week.
Sure. Yeah, good for me. Good for you.
Thank you so much.
Lovely
Namaste.
seeing you. Have a wonderful day and see you soon. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye everybody. Farewell.
Recording stopped.
Very good.